This is the Wednesday afternoon, April 3rd, 2019 afternoon session of the Portland City Council. Hello, Carla, again. Could you please call the roll?
Thank you. Fish?
Here.
Hardesty?
Here.
Udaly?
Here.
Fritz?
Here.
Wheeler?
Here. And now we'll turn it over to legal counsel, who will give us a few words on the rules of decorum. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Portland City Council. The City Council represents all Portlanders and meets to do the city's business. The presiding officer preserves order and decorum during City Council meetings so that everyone can feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe. To participate in council meetings, you may sign up in advance with the council clerk's office for communications to briefly speak about any subject. You may also sign up for public testimony on resolutions or first readings of ordinances. Your testimony should address the matter being considered at the time. If it does not, you may be ruled out of order. When testifying, please state your name for the record. Your address is not necessary. Please disclose if you are a lobbyist. If you are representing an organization, please identify it. The presiding officer determines the length of testimony. Individuals generally have 3 minutes to testify unless otherwise stated. When you have 30 seconds left, a yellow light goes on. When your time is done, a red light goes on. If you're in the audience and would like to show your support for something that is said, please feel free to do a thumbs up. If you want to express that you do not support something, please feel free to do a thumbs down. Please remain seated in council chambers unless entering or exiting. If you are filming the proceedings, please do not use bright lights or disrupt the meeting. Disruptive conduct such as shouting or interrupting testimony or council deliberations will not be allowed. If there are disruptions, a warning will be given that further disruption may result in the person being ejected for the remainder of the meeting. After being ejected, a person who fails to leave the meeting is subject to arrest for trespass. Thank you for helping your fellow Portlanders feel welcome, comfortable, respected, and safe.
Very good. And I'd just like to add for the record, one of the core rules here is to understand and appreciate that you will hear differences of opinion from your own at the microphones. That's what democracy is all about. And in particular, tomorrow when we get to the public testimony part of this, I'm going to continue to admonish people to understand that there will be different perspectives, different points of view. Everybody will have access to the microphone, but we just ask that everybody listen to everybody else's opinion respectfully. With that, could we read both items together, Carla, and then I'll turn it over to Commissioner Udaly.
Yes. 294, add evaluation of applicants for dwelling units to include renter protections in the form of screening criteria regulations. And 295, add security deposits, prepaid rent to include renter protections in the form of security deposit regulations.
Thank you. Commissioner Udaly.
Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to introduce our fair access and renting proposal, a fitting kickoff to April, which is National Fair Housing Month. Given that this day has been more than 2 years in the making, and we're introducing the most significant tenant protection package we've advanced since our relocation ordinance in January of 2017, you would think I'd have a lengthy and eloquent opening statement prepared. I actually just wrote this before the hearing. I have thought long and hard about what I wanted to say today, but I've decided to let the policy mostly speak for itself. However, before I move on to housekeeping, 2 minor amendments, and hand the presentation over to our esteemed panel, I offer the following comments and a piece of testimony for my colleagues to consider. As elected representatives, we have an obligation to ensure reasonable access to housing and to affirmatively further fair housing law, which was created to prevent housing discrimination. Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act in these very chambers. And last year, as well as throughout the past decade, we have heard from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon that discrimination in housing is alive and well in our state and in our city. This package, if passed, will significantly decrease incidents of housing discrimination, whether by default or design. Housing is a basic need, a human right, and a finite resource. Our failure to protect tenants and stabilize rents has contributed to an unprecedented housing crisis, which is now in its 10th year. It has changed the face of our city, decimated communities, and impacted the future of tens of thousands of Portland residents. It's terrible for our economy, our environment, our social and cultural fabric, and our spirit. We are not acting fast enough to remedy this crisis. While this policy does not increase the supply of affordable units, it does decrease multiple barriers to housing, which is an essential piece of what must be a multifaceted approach to solving this crisis. Finally, I've been disappointed to hear some of the misinformation circulating about the impact and intent of these policies. Simply put, we are not forcing landlords to rent to people with criminal records. As you will hear, we are providing a low-barrier option for screening based on solid data and research, while allowing landlords to opt to do individualized assessments instead, a practice recommended by HUD federal guidelines, upon which they are free to decline prospective renters based on non-discriminatory business interests. I'm a longtime Portland resident, a renter, a woman, a mother, and a violent crime survivor. The suggestion that I am so committed to renters as a class of people, above all else, that I would advance policies that would endanger other renters is false. I'm willing to assume the best and chalk this up to confusion and concern, but once we present the actual policy, I hope that we can lay this false claim to rest. As a survivor, I know what it's like to fear for my safety and the critical role that safe, stable housing plays in that. I also know that when we deny opportunities for housing and employment to individuals coming out of the justice system, we make our whole community less safe. This is a complicated and thorny issue. It's one we've kicked down the road for decades, and I don't know whether we can ever adequately address it through policymaking. But what we can do here today is share data and research to help people make sound decisions based on fact, not fear. Now I'm going to share a message I received earlier this week from an impacted community member. This morning I read an article about your proposal to change rental policies in Portland. I cannot thank you enough for your insight, kindness, and consideration regarding housing opportunities in Portland. I am a convicted felon and have no fair chance at finding a safe place to rent. I'm refused despite the fact that I'm a first-time offender and I have both a bachelor's degree and master's degree. My credit score is in the high 700s. I have voluntarily completed evaluations to prove that I am not a danger and I present no threat to anyone. Despite this, I am told that as a felon, I am an imminent risk to other renters. Just looking at me, you would never know that I am a felon. I am treated as a person until I have to indicate that I was convicted of a felony. At that point, everything changes. I lose my humanity and my chance to be a member of society in the eyes of many. The message is clear. I am not worthy of housing, and despite any evidence to the contrary, being a felon means that I will harm others. In the 2018 study conducted by the Justice Department, nearly 2.2 million adults were held in America's prisons and jails at the end of 2016. I think of the men and women who are daughters, sons, mothers, and fathers who also happen to be felons and are consistently denied housing because of the fear surrounding the label of felon. I'm thankful that I have a supportive family who welcome me home with love. I will live with them until I can afford to purchase something because I know I have no hope of renting. Thank you for your courage to bring a voice to those of us that do not have one and have not been allowed a seat at the table. Now for some housekeeping. Colleagues, we opted to hold 2 hearings, as you know, one for our presentation and invited speakers, which includes some opponents to our policies, and one for public testimony, and that's because of the number of people we anticipate will want to testify and how long that would take. We thought you might want to go home before midnight tonight. Yes. I encourage all of you to consider today to be similar to a work session. It's our chance to really delve into the policy, to ask questions, to deliberate. We've brought multiple experts for you to hear from, but I would strongly prefer that you hold your questions for the end of each presentation because they've been carefully planned and thought out. Chances are your questions will be answered by the end. Finally, these two ordinances must be advanced together. They don't work well or effectively on their own. Every word of them has been heavily negotiated with stakeholders and carefully vetted over the past 2 years. We have not received any amendments in advance from other offices, but we understand there may be some. I respectfully request that they be shared with my office in advance and not introduced until tomorrow's session in order for us to respond to your concerns and work with your offices, and that they will be voted on 2 weeks from now when the full package comes back for a vote. Finally, I have 2 minor amendments to make before we begin the presentation. For the past 2 years, our office has worked very closely with City Attorney Lisa Gramp, who left the city to work for the State Housing Department at the end of last year. We're grateful for the other attorneys who all pitched in and put a tremendous amount of work in to help put the code language into its final form, but there were 2 small items that were incorrectly interpreted and not caught by staff before we submitted the document for today's session. So in order to uphold the promises we made to the community and make sure the policy language fulfills the original intentions, here are the 2 changes we need to make. You should all have a red line version in front of you. Amendment number 1, amend screening criteria code section D.4.B to adjust the look-back periods for non-heads of household. Amendment number 2, amend security deposit code section F to clarify the length of time for the payment history requirement. Can I get a second?
Second.
All right, thank you.
Yes, I was reading.
With that, let's get started. We have a long and interesting hearing before us. Our first panel will be Tyrone Poole, founder and owner of One App Oregon, Jamie Duhamel, Director of Policy for my office, and Dr. Lisa Bates, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Urban Studies at Portland State University. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
And please state your name for the record.
My name is Tyrone Poole, and I am the founder and president of One App.
Oh, Jamie Duhamel, Director of Policy for Commissioner Udaly.
Lisa Bates.
All right, would you like me to begin? All right, well, I would like to start off by letting everybody know I have spent the last 10 plus years of my life in housing advocacy. I've been working really hard to create access to housing for some of Portland's most vulnerable families. Outside of that, it would be good to make sure that you understand that I am not actually pro or against this rule. I am here to make sure that there's enough accurate data being presented so that you guys have enough information to make a good decision on if this law should pass or not. So with that, I would like to go right into some of the data and the things that I've learned over the last 5 years of running One App. A lot of it will be very shocking and exciting to know. So with One App, the reason I'm going to go over the software with you, that way you understand clearly what the data that comes out of this software came from and how it's created, because this data was used, a lot of the data points were used to create the rest of the documents that you'll hear today. Starting with One App, when we first designed One App, we had the premise that we could create access to housing for everybody if we let everyone know where they qualified to live. Through my own homeless experience, that seemed like what made the most sense. People would apply to places that they qualify for if they just knew where they qualified. Based on your background check, you could qualify for a very small percentage of the market. I mean, a lot of people that have evictions and felonies or low income, they qualify for 1% of the market. That's 10 out of 1,000 units. The amount of money and time it would take for you to find one of those random needle in a haystack properties can be so much and so expensive that it creates homelessness that's unnecessary. People qualify for housing, they just can't navigate the rental market. It costs too much and it takes too much time. So we developed One App, which was a tool that would let a renter see exactly where they qualify based on their background check. December of 2017, we launched One App Oregon, And this is what you are seeing on the screen here. This is the map view. This is what happens when a renter on one app pulls their background check and can see every single property they qualify for. Green are approved properties, red are properties that you don't qualify for. We don't say denied because we're not the property. So what we actually say is these are action required, which means that there's work to do to get into this property. And yellow or orange is conditionally approved. So it's usually a double deposit or some other conditions you have to meet to move in, but you still pass. When we went out, when we launched this in December 12th, we ran this all through the entire 2018 year. And what we found, first of all, what would you think happens in a city where renters can see exactly where they qualify to live? We assumed that you would move into the properties that you qualify to live at. That's actually not the case whatsoever. We found that even when people could see where they qualify, only 10% of families or households moves into approved properties. 57% moved into properties they were conditionally approved for or applied to, and 33% applied to properties they were denied to, even though they had complete vision on where they could live. So when we found out this information, we realized that we were unable to change human behavior. People do not apply to where they qualify. They apply to where they want to live. There are a few reasons when we communicated with different people, we did test and we asked, why is it that you did not apply to where you qualified? And one of the biggest feedbacks are community. They have their church, they have their home, they have their school, they have their parents, and they just cannot move to areas where the green pins are. If they're in Vancouver, they qualified in Beaverton, but they live in Gresham and that's where their community is, that's where they need to stay, so they will apply to denied properties. And a lot of the time, it was simply the properties that were green, they weren't interested in. This last weekend went by and I spoke to a family who came in to look for a place, and there was a 3-bedroom in the area that they were approved for. And I was like, what's wrong with this one? And she looked at it and said, that one has the blue bedrooms. I've seen that one. I'm like, okay. She's like, I have 2 daughters. That was enough to not apply to the green pin and apply to deny properties. So no matter how hard we try, we are unable to get people to apply where they approve. So that changed the culture of One App. Because we can actually see every single reason why a person is denied on every single application in extreme detail, we are able to put together solutions to help people get into properties they do qualify for. So that changed into One App's new mission is not only to show you where you qualify, but provide you with the tools in order to be approved to where you want to live. This is what actually attracted me to working with Jamie, because I knew at this point that the product we had was not enough, and she was working on something that actually helped people get approved to places that she wanted to live. They want to live. So it was extremely exciting. I have never been paid a single dollar from Jamie's office. Every single bit of effort I put in was on our own time and money because I was very excited to create a solution to get people into housing. I think it's good that people understand that so they don't think that I was that this data is tainted in any way. This is a sneak peek into One App 2.0 that's not launched yet. I wanted to show you this because it shows you what market-driven solutions look like in order to create access to housing. This is what this is an average renter. This renter looks like they're conditionally approved for credit. They pass the other things outside of rental history. And we have products in this marketplace that will help you be approved. One of the products that is our most powerful product that we're able to do with the data is we created a product called the One App Guarantee. We found that out of all the denials that took place in 2018, 71% would have been approved if they had a cosigner. It is the one process that management companies use almost across the board to mitigate risks for renters that don't qualify. If your income is too low a little bit, if your credit is just below par, if you don't have a rental history, not been at your job long enough, a cosigner will get you through the door. The problem is virtually no one applies with a cosigner. Even though it's a powerful tool, people just don't have access to it. So we developed a cosigner product that we will get on the lease with you, and we will cover the damages and lost rent if a person is to be denied. And so this was our way to help more renters get access to housing. Working with Jamie and hearing Jamie's proposal, it was so exciting because you could just snap your finger and then all the pins light up green and people have access to housing where they never had a chance to get in before. So that's how the data works. Every single renter who pulls their background check on one app, when they click apply to a property, it not only tells them if they're approved and not a conditional, but it tells them exactly why they don't qualify in detail. And then it stores that information so that we can see in the future. Down to detail, it will literally say, this property requires 7 accounts and collections. You have 9. You must remedy 2 accounts. And it shows you all 7 accounts and collections, the dollar amount owed for each, and the phone number to call reported by the credit bureau. So you can, and then now we can say, $1,000 would have helped how many people? Because we can see the dollar amount of each account. We can see, we did some data just to show how our data works, and we pulled every single Section 8 voucher because last year they raised the Section 8 limits on all their vouchers, and it only created access to less than 3% of housing based on our data because income wasn't why people were being denied, right? We had 17% were denied from criminal history. A huge percent was from rental history. So you can actually see this information. You can kind of more accurately know where to target. So that's the data. That's how it works. There's one thing that I wanted to make sure that I helped change and inform the narrative of this conversation going forward, because originally when I first spoke with Jamie's group, I had this impression that was kind of created just universally about what property management companies are. And because I went through my own homeless experience, I kind of had my own idea what they were. And it's really, the pictures of them has been painted as, fat cats. They're wealthy, they are sitting with their feet up, and they don't do anything but collect rent. And they just have the ability to, they just have a lot of wealth and time. And during this process of following Jamie around for nearly a year now and working with lots of management companies, I found that that's actually not the case for the majority of management companies. Management companies, as a matter of fact, most of them make little to no money. And when I say no money, I mean most of the ones we spoke to barely make enough to go get by with their companies. So I just want to make sure that is thrown out. Also, one of the big things that if you change the premise that management companies are wealthy and don't care about people, and you go into and you look at it through the eyes of they are business owners that need to create profit and make a living like everybody else, then you start to look at denials differently. Every time a person was denied back in the day, I thought it meant you're not good enough to live here, right? In reality, after doing this research, I realized that what it really means is that I don't have the support systems in place to support you as a tenant. So because of that, I can't let you live here. And if you follow that premise further, you'll understand that most management companies' screening criteria is not actually designed to determine risk at all. Screening criteria, when you meet with these owners, are actually a reflection of their personalities. It is. Believe it or not, if a screening criteria says we don't accept renters who don't have 2 years of rental history, it doesn't mean that they think you're going to default. What it means is that I'm not in this to teach you how to be a renter, right? You need to learn how to manage a house or rent outside of me. And so once I met with them and I spoke to landlords and understood that majority of them actually got into the business because they wanted to create access to housing, I started to look at the screening criteria differently. And then I spoke to different owners who were doing well what the criteria was asking to happen, right? When we say 2 times the rent, I went to owners that do 2 times the rent. And I said, how are you successful with this? And and the majority of them told me I could use their name, so I plan on doing this thing. But one of the Mo Farland was one of the ones I spoke to from Stark First Property Management. He has 1,250 units, and he actually has so much passion for helping families that are rent burdened to the point to where he actually, every person that he helps, he knows them by name, even though he has over 1,000 properties. And he says when a person can't pay rent, they walk into his property and he sits down with them and he says, "Where's my money?" And then if they say, you know, "I had car issues," or "I had this or that," he's like, "Next month, you pay your rent on time. This month, we're gonna break this rent payment that's due now. Don't worry about it. We'll break it over 3 months down the road." And he does that for every single person who does not pay the rent on time, that missed it. And that's just part of his business model because he knows how to manage rent burden families very, very well. And if they don't pay during that payment plan, he still has options for them to continue. Another company that does this really well is Fortress. They do something very similar. I even spoke to Central City Concern because they do 1.5 times the rent. And I'm like, how are you successful with this? And they actually have a fund. So at Central City Concern, if you're denied, or not denied, if you miss a rent payment, they actually send your 72-hour notice to a resident service coordinator at Central City Concern that calls you and asks you basically what your scenario is. Then if you can't pay, they send out on your behalf rent assistance requests to all the programs they're partnered with. And then if those don't come back and pay, 2 times a year out of their own fund, they will pay the rent. So you can default 2 times per year and be covered. These are not solutions that the average property management companies possess, right? So I met with criminal, and not to drag it up, I met with criminal owners who take criminal history. I mean, they just literally accept anybody with criminal. And one gentleman in particular that I wouldn't mention his name, he said he literally knows every single parole officer in Portland by name. And he said if they saw him, they would know him by face. And he loves helping out people with criminal histories because of the fact that he can sit right across from them and tell them his story because he was a felon, and then also let them know that he's not judging them and he will provide the supports. And when they start making mistakes, he will look right across the table from them and he sees if they have bloodshot eyes, he'll like, "I can tell you've been using, this is a violation, you can go back to prison." And he basically works with them on a personal level every single time. Central City Concern takes criminals as well, and their issue, they have an actual program that's called Flip the Script that their criminal, people with criminal history are part of that program, and that provides a huge amount of support. And I asked the associate that I spoke to there, if that criminal program didn't exist, would those programs, would those criminals do well? And she said no. So the only reason I'm bringing this up is because I know that we're going to paint a picture of, first of all, I want to let you know, I actually want, throughout my homeless process, faith is really the only thing that got me through it. And I want those pins on that map to be green for people more than probably anybody else in this room. But at the same time, I mean, it's not a job for me. This is what I'm here to do right now. You know, this is my mission. But I need to make sure that you understand the risk that you run by passing the criteria. Not the risk, just the work, the effort that's going to be required to make it successful on the property management side. You are talking about letting renters into properties that management companies are not equipped to support, right? Only so many management companies are taking 2 times because they're good at it. But the ones that don't take 2 times are not good at it. So they're going to need supports in order to be successful with that. You have people who don't know how to manage felons. You know, not saying that every felon is an issue, but some of them do come with their own level of supports. And if these management companies don't have the tools in place, when the traffic starts to come in, then it will be issues. During this process, I've realized that everybody's been chasing the wrong thing. Everybody's been trying to figure out, how do you find what creates defaults? We want to find the magic number that says your credit score below this means that you'll get evicted. You know, you won't pay rent. Your rental history this low means that you're going to be a problem. And you try to find this perfect number that you can say, this is the number that you should approve people above and this is below. But after doing this research with Jamie, I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe there is no perfect number. Any renter will do well if placed in the right property management company that has the right supports for them, which means defaults really only occur when renters are matched with properties that aren't equipped to support their unique barriers. And so if that's the case, then, and we're going to make sure we pass this, we have to make sure we put in the effort to make sure that these management companies have the tools and solution to support the new applicants and the new characteristics of people that they have never supported before. That is really what I wanted to make, because I want this to be successful. So that was what I wanted to make sure was understood on both sides of it. And I am very excited for you to see the amount of access this rule could create if passed.
So, thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Poole. I heard Commissioner Udaley say she wants to hold off on public testimony, but Commissioner Hardesty has a
You mean
question.
question? Yeah, no, just until the end of each presentation.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, I just
Commissioner
didn't want-
Hardesty. All right, good, thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
Mayor, and thank you, Commissioner Udaley, for the clarification.
They ask questions?
Tyrone, you're one of my heroes. And you're one of my heroes because you were someone that was knocked down through no fault of your own, and you kept your eyes really focused. When I first moved here, I had no history, but I walked into an apartment complex owned by a woman and said, just moved here, start my job next week, don't have a lot of money, don't have any local references. And she looked me in the eye and said, give me $50 and you can move in.
Mm-hmm.
That would almost never happen today.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a difference between nonprofit property owners like Central City Concern that has a host of programs that are geared towards giving people a second and third and maybe even a fourth chance, and providing resident services that actually help people troubleshoot their problems.
Yep.
That's one kind of rental opportunity,
Yep.
right? Then we're talking private owners who today can kind of pick and choose, and you know, if you own a property, you really just want the easiest opportunity possible. The first person that walks up that you know has 3 to 4 times the money, that's probably your person, right? Because you know they're gonna pay the rent and you don't have to worry about it. I'm talking about an ideal world.
Yep.
We are not in an ideal world at this moment.
Yep.
We are in a real crisis. We have people, thousands of people living on our street. For me, I feel that we have an obligation to make housing available at every income level in every neighborhood. And I think we have to partner. So based on your personal experience, based on you following Jamie around for a year, and I'd love to be able to follow Jamie around for a year, and you said you didn't have an opinion. I need you to have an opinion because I need to know that,
Right.
I mean, there's an ideal world scenario,
Yep.
and then there's the real world that we're living in today, right?
Right.
How do we get out of this crisis if we don't start putting pieces in place to make sure that everyone has the opportunity? You said faith was what kept you going.
Yep.
Some days faith is really hard to come by, especially when you've just
my
been
assignment.
kicked, right?
Yep.
So can you help me as I think about how do I do what's in the best interest of Portlanders
Yep. Yep.
in a crisis? Because again, in the ideal world, we'd have a lot of time and we could debate back and forth. We're in crisis.
Right.
What would you
So
recommend for me?
this criteria, if passed, would create a utopia for housing, right? People have access to places. The only fear, like the solution, I don't want to say this the wrong way. Once this criteria passes, like I said, there will be a lot of management companies that, remember, these aren't the really wealthy. Matter of fact, let me give you some perspective on the market. Most industries are 80-20, which means 20% of the management, or the 20% of the business is controlled, or 80% of the business are controlled by 20% of the companies. So a few people control almost all the market, and then a tiny few, pick scraps. That's not how it works in rental. It's one of the only markets that's the opposite. So 25 companies, the top 25 companies in Oregon, out of 389 licensed management companies, First one's 14,000 units. The 25th company is 900, all right? 369 companies, which makes up 80% of the rental market, is the long tail of 369 companies of private management companies with 150 units under management. So if you understand the market first, and you know that what you really is changing the law, not on the few top big ones that, yes, they are wealthy in this, but it's really on the 369 tiny companies. So if you understand that, and you know you're going to, that change has to happen. So you put this out there, and what you're asking is for every management company to be efficient in every renter type simultaneously, right? So that can be a little, it can be a little tricky, because you're saying you need to be good at managing rent burden families. You need to be good at managing people with criminal history. You need to be good at managing people who don't have any
So
criminal history.
I'm going to cut this off
Right,
because
Yeah.
I think it's actually really important that we hear the actual presentation and then we hear from Dr.
but
Bates.
I get it, but I just wanted to make sure, since she asked me the direct question of
Yeah.
how to fix it, or how would I change it, I would say if I was to pass it, then I would make sure that there was a time span before it went into place that made sure that Multifamily Housing Northwest, other programs and agencies had the ability to train and educate their people on solutions on how to manage all of these different characters of renters that they are not used to managing
Right,
beforehand.
and that's why we have a delayed implementation. And I'm also a huge fan of yours and think One
Right,
App is
right.
brilliant, but I do need to push back a little bit. As I explained in my opening remarks, landlords are not being forced to rent to people
No,
based on non-discriminatory business issues. We are not asking the private market to take on tenants who would require supportive services to be successful in housing. And I also want to point out that 25% of our renters are already spending 50% or more of their income on housing. And I can't understand for the life of me why it's not acceptable at the outset of that rental agreement to be spending 50%, but it's perfectly acceptable to allow landlords to raise it to 50% and above
Right.
during their tenancy. So
right,
I
but
wanna-
that's different question than she asked,
Yeah.
but yes, I
Right,
agree.
But I don't,
I appreciate it.
cannot-
I withdraw my question because I didn't want to take us down a different
Yeah.
path. I just
No,
had a
that
very.
was, I just wanted to answer it to say, to be successful, just train them. That's all I would
So
say.
let's move on to
But could I
Jamie's
just ask a question,
presentation.
please?
I'd like to save the questions till the end of this presentation because we're already getting into the weeds.
I apologize.
All right, so let's agree on this then as a
sent this
protocol.
down
So do you want us at the end of each panel to ask questions? How
Well,
about
this
we do
is
it
the
that way?
presentation. These three people have
Okay.
worked a lot on this policy.
Okay, so then you let us know when it's time for questions.
And the following panels are invited testimony.
We will respect whatever
Yeah.
you want us to do,
Thank you.
Commissioner.
All right.
I just had a quick question that went along.
Yes,
Yeah.
let's do it.
Thank you.
What, are you leaving?
No.
Rotate.
Oh, that's exciting. Thank you.
Give me a minute to pull this up. So, Carla, how do I access the notes version on this screen? Can you help me for a sec?
You can't do that from up and down.
You can't do both. Okay. Well, it's a good thing I printed off my notes in case there was an issue. I was worried about that. Okay. So forgive me, I'm going to do a lot of looking down and looking up, but I'm going to do my best to stay engaged and read my notes here. So thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners and Mayor, and thank you, Tyrone, for sharing the stories and the data. We really appreciate the time that you've spent with us on this policy. Again, my name is Jamie Duhamel, and I'm the Director of Policy for Commissioner Udaly. For the past 2 years, I have had the unique honor of working on this fair access and renting proposal with many community members, advocates, landlords, and private and public interests. I'm going to start this presentation by going over the outreach and development it took our office to get to this stage. But before I begin, I want to emphasize that we took an intentionally different approach to creating the code that you see before you today. Most of the time in government, we set our sights on fixing a problem. We give it our best shot based on our expertise, some internal guidance, and some selective input. Only then do we launch it into the public for feedback before making adjustments and bringing it to you. Instead, what we are presenting to you today was not created by our office alone, but was created with everyone you see in this room, or at least the invited testimony, and more. Regardless of whether or not they are ultimately here to support it, what you are seeing is literally the 33rd draft, and we're pretty proud of it. So let's start with a general timeline. This timeline only represents the work we did on the screening criteria part of the FAIR proposal. So we actually, in fact, began working on the security deposit proposal in February of 2017, and an early draft was completed by the summer of 2017. That draft was run through the Relocation Technical Advisory Group before it was disbanded, and once we began work on the screening criteria, it was integrated into some of the workshops and groups represented here in the timeline. So as you can see, the FAIR proposal timeline starting in January of 2018 kind of represents three major buckets. We started with an internal advisory group with a deep equity lens for a few months and created our first early draft. Then in the spring of 2018, we launched it publicly, and we conducted face-to-face workshops with everyone in the city who would spend time with us. And then we took that final draft late last year and ran a beta test with the final information. I want to emphasize that the number that you saw on there was 125.5 hours. I took meticulous notes as we developed this policy. It does not represent the phone calls, the emails, the one-off conversations, and all of the in-between work. That was literally face-to-face workshop time, me and others sitting around tables discussing the points of policy. So we started, like I mentioned, with an internal advisory group with a deep equity lens. The very first thing we did was create a mission statement that I used throughout the entire process as my guiding North Star when negotiating changes to the policy drafts. I didn't quite realize it at the time, but it was a critical part of helping me evaluate the wide variety of needs, interests, and suggestion for the entire next year of work. As you can see, the mission statement says we wanted to create clear channels to access housing of choice for all renters, regardless of background, that is consistent, fair, and equitable, and maintains dignity and humanity for the renter. With our workshops, we met with a large variety of impacted community members, including housing providers, to negotiate the details. As you can see, we spent almost 55% of our time in workshop with private market and affordable housing providers, and there were significant improvements to our policy drafts because of it. I've provided each of you with a chart outlining the ways in which the policy was adapted over time to address industry concerns to land on this final version. And we'll dig into the beta test development later in the presentation. Through the process of outreach and development, we came to 5 conclusions that guided our outcomes. We'll go into each of these in detail, but in general, the findings are as follows. First, that the Fair Housing Act sets the standard for addressing housing discrimination, and indeed, the Fair Housing Act is being violated here in the city of Portland. Number 2, affordability has disproportionate impacts on protected classes. Number 3, screening barriers have disproportionate impacts on protected classes. Number 4, the industry relies on methodologies to assess risk. And number 5, changes to screening practice can address discriminatory outcomes. First, the Fair Housing Act sets the standard for addressing housing discrimination. In developing our findings, we used the disparate impact theory as upheld by the Supreme Court in 2015 to assess whether discrimination in housing occurs and who is impacted the most. The disparate impact theory holds housing providers legally liable for setting policies that don't have disproportionate outcomes, regardless of their intent. Additionally, the Fair Housing Act requires all governmental jurisdictions to affirmatively further federal fair housing law, which means that we must act if we know discrimination in housing is happening and has been interpreted to also apply to efforts to eliminate segregation. Finally, HUD's General Counsel recommends individualized assessments as the best practice for mitigating discriminatory outcomes, particularly for justice-involved individuals. these are all important findings for understanding the baseline we needed to use for identifying the scope of the problem and the right solutions. Understanding our obligations under the Fair Housing Act, then, we must ask ourselves if discrimination in housing is occurring in Portland. In fact, we have known for at least 10 years that it is, because testing by the Fair Housing Council has shown discrimination in 2010, 2015, and most recently in 2018. Today, we know that 1 in 4 renters face disparate treatment based on race and nation of origin. The audit also found, and I quote, "The most common issue identified was the provision of different terms and conditions and availability of units. Of the 13 positive tests, there was evidence of differing information provided to protected class testers with regard to rental terms and conditions, including differing rental price amounts, move-in specials, deposits, application fees, and screening criteria. The different information favored the comparative tester over the protected class tester. In the race color positive test, the protected African American Black testers were told about higher rental prices and fewer units than their white counterparts," unquote. So we've already established that the Fair Housing Act requires governments to affirmatively further fair housing law, and the Supreme Court has upheld the disparate impact theory, which the audit demonstrates is happening right now in Portland. Our second finding is that there is clear discrimination in affordability. So while property values and home prices are skyrocketing, average wages for people of color are going down. Because all or almost all of the city's neighborhoods are unaffordable to many people of color, we are reinforcing economic segregation through displacement and putting inordinate strain on affordable housing providers and their very limited housing stock. We will explore this problem in more detail a little bit later. However, we have a few maps from the Housing Bureau's most recent State of Housing report. For Latinx households, only 2 neighborhoods can be classified as affordable. The term affordable, defined by HUD, is paying 30% or more or less of income on housing costs, and that roughly equates to about 3 times a month's rent income ratio, income to rent ratio. For Black households, no neighborhoods are affordable. And for Native American households, no neighborhoods are affordable. This map provided by Metro demonstrates that economic segregation has significant impacts on people of color. More and more families are being pushed to less resourced parts of our city and are being pushed out of the city completely. As Tyrone explained earlier, families will often apply to units they don't qualify for because they want to have choice over where they live and the communities they raise their children in. Right now, people have very little choice. Our third finding is that commonly used screening criteria have disproportionate impacts on protected classes. Let's start with credit history. State law gives explicit rights to landlords to screen for credit scores and credit issues. However, research from the National Fair Housing Alliance, as well as the National Consumer Law Center, and many more, prove that current credit scoring systems have disparate impacts on people of color and were designed to support housing discrimination at their core. Through redlining, predatory lending, disparate wage gaps, and other racist government policies, the average credit score for Black and Latinx people are approximately half that of white non-Hispanics. Additionally, credit scores and accounts do not reflect positive rental payments, and in fact, companies often do not report positive credit payments at all. If you are a renter with a limited income and a lack of assets, you often have to choose between keeping a roof over your head or paying a student loan on time. One is an essential need not reflected in credit, while the other communicates false information about your ability to pay rent. Finally, both FICO and TransUnion released reports that found borrowers with higher FICO scores are in many ways acting the way borrowers with very low scores are predicted to act, and during the subprime mortgage crisis, their delinquency rates were 4 times that of borrowers with credit scores below 600. In fact, many lenders that do not rely on credit scoring mechanisms at all experience default rates that are lower than industry standard. As is well known, screening for criminal history also has disproportionate impacts. Locally, we know people of color are 5 times as likely to be incarcerated as their white counterparts. In fact, Oregon ranks 7th in the country for incarceration rates of our Black population. Nationally, Black and Latinx individuals comprise an estimated 58% of the U.S. prison population, despite accounting for only 25% of the total U.S. population. These impacts are well documented by HUD and form the foundation of their guidance around individualized assessments. Additionally, National Healthcare for the Homeless Council found that justice-involved individuals are subject to public policies that impede successful reintegration into society, especially housing, leading to higher rates of recidivism and homelessness. So in essence, we allow justice-involved individuals to continue to be punished even after they have served their time imposed on them by the justice system. The stigma of past incarceration continues to drive public policies that either exacerbate or quietly allows a lack of access to fundamental resources, like housing, that enable them to contribute positively to society and avoid negative outcomes, like increased recidivism and homelessness. It's a vicious cycle of our own making. We must create policy that promotes a culture of early rehousing. Eviction histories is the third category of discriminatory barriers. We don't have local eviction data available, but a 2018 eviction study in Seattle found that over 51% of tenants in eviction filings were people of color. 31% were Black tenants experiencing eviction at a rate 4.5 times what would be expected based on their demographics in Seattle. Additionally, a study published by the Harvard Civil Liberties Law Review found that Hispanics in predominantly white neighborhoods were twice as likely to be evicted and more likely to be evicted when their landlord was non-Hispanic. Considering Portland's legacy and demographics, it is reasonable for us to assume similar outcomes here. Our fourth finding is that landlords, and really the industry as a whole, uses risk methodologies to assess applicant risk. This isn't intentional on their part. This is simply how the business of providing housing has developed to maximize time and money. Many people believe that renting to someone with a criminal history will make the community and neighborhood unsafe, and they are less likely to be good tenants. But a study conducted by a Minnesota-based research collaborative and Wilder Research found that misdemeanor offenses that occurred more than 3 years ago and felony offenses that occurred more than 5 years ago have no significant effect on rental housing outcomes. To determine negative housing outcomes, the researchers looked at evictions based on lease violations for behavior, non-payment of rent, leave without notice, and a category called other. It goes on to explain that even when negative outcomes occurred, the average stay was 1.5 years before the outcome, which is still pretty good. More specifically, 11 of 15 criminal offense categories, including violent felonies, have no significant effect on housing outcomes. In other words, they were just as likely as tenants with no criminal history to have positive or negative outcomes. Even the 4 of the 15 criminal offense categories that may increase the likelihood of negative housing outcomes only does so by 3 to 9 percentage points at most, and the study claims that is an overestimation. Criminal recidivism research shows that juvenile offenders pose little to no risk of going on to become long-term recidivists of criminal behavior. And research also shows that recidivism rates of offenders decrease to almost the rate of non-offenders after approximately 7 years. This time frame of 7 years is widely accepted and is often used in employment screenings as well. What research shows is that the longer the time since a criminal offense was committed, the less likely a person is to re-offend at all. Time since offense is the essential factor here. Finally, research has also shown that recidivism rates double for formerly incarcerated adults who do not have stable housing. We have heard repeatedly from landlords that renting to people with criminal histories increases their legal liabilities. In fact, no landlord has ever been held legally liable for the criminal act of a tenant based on their decision to rent to someone with a criminal history alone. A research report published by the NYU Journal of Legislation and Public Policy found that past criminal history is not an appropriate predictor of future criminal behavior because there is no straight line to draw from one offense to another, which is why case law upholds that landlords cannot be held legally liable for the acts of others unless it was foreseeable based on previous behavior on that same property or was foreseeable because the landlord did not provide a safe and secure premises. So for example, if a tenant has a broken lock on their front door and the landlord doesn't fix it, If that tenant is burglarized or harmed from someone entering their unit, the landlord can be held liable for not fixing the lock. In fact, no state in the country, and this is really important, no state in the country even requires screening of tenants for any barriers, let alone criminal histories. Landlords often have the right to do so if they want, but they are not required to consider any barriers because it is not a landlord's legal obligation to keep certain people out. The industry is using credit scores as a shortcut to determining an applicant's sense of financial responsibility. Since we have already established that credit scores, and indeed the entire credit system, is inherently racist and not reflective of actual risk, using the scores alone is not appropriate and just perpetuates racial disparities. The only debt that truly matters in this circumstance would be debts owed to previous landlords. And finally, a very common myth is that people with eviction histories are going to be bad tenants. An eviction record alone is not a predictor of anything because of disproportionate use. Evictions are used as a means of retaliation and discrimination, so the types of evictions are important as well as the length of time since the evictions occurred. For non-payments of rent, which represent the vast majority of evictions, someone can be evicted for any amount they were short, $20, for example, and landlords are not obligated to extend the time for payments. As Tyrone mentioned, some of the really good ones do, and we're really grateful for that. But if they want them out, it is a perfect opportunity. And in the current affordability crisis renters are dealing with, those opportunities present themselves more often. Regardless, that circumstance should not prevent someone from ever accessing housing again. There is literally no way for a renter to overcome the stigma of a previous eviction until they are given the opportunity to build a better rental history. It's a catch-22 that leads to homelessness. Instead, only specific patterns of recent behavior can accurately assess risk. Non-payment of rent, again, it can be for any amount, that occurred several years ago has no direct relevant bearing on whether or not someone can pay rent today. And just like with criminal history, if they've gone several years without an eviction, it would indicate that they have established some form of stability or should at least be given the chance to demonstrate that they have. Our last finding is that reforming the way landlords screen for tenancies can mitigate many of the issues we have described. Reforming screening criteria is not a new concept to the city. In fact, in 2011, the Fair Housing Action Plan, then under Commissioner Fish, was developed to give policy recommendations to end housing discrimination. As you can see, recommendation number 4 specifically called for changes to screening criteria. The action plan also said, and I quote, "This action plan sets forth the specific actions the City of Portland, through the Portland Housing Bureau, will take in 2011 to 2012 as the first set of bold steps over the next 5 years to end discrimination in rental housing. It builds on the visionary work of the Analysis of Impediments Review Committee and provides a comprehensive approach, blending enforcement, education, and increased access to affordable homes and services." And we just want to thank and are grateful for Commissioner Fish's leadership on that. In addition, calls to change screening criteria and affirmatively further fair housing law is in the A Home for Everyone 2016 to 2017 Housing Work Group Action Plan. Finally, but most importantly, calls for changing screening criteria have been coming from impacted tenants and advocates for decades. I will let those who are here today and tomorrow speak for themselves. As the city's fair housing audit demonstrated, a lack of regulations and standards in the screening process has allowed a culture of discrimination, intentional or not, to flourish. Each landlord is allowed wide latitude in what they screen for, how they process applications, what income ratio and barriers they think determines risk. This environment makes fair housing testing and enforcement more difficult and violations nearly impossible to prove. Discrimination is not always intentional. Standardized screening practices with key accountability mechanisms can make fair housing requirements much easier for landlords to understand and apply in their everyday practice, and should give them more peace of mind that they are doing the right thing and have less legal liability in court because of it. The 4 key solutions are on the screen, and in summary, we are recommending to use recognized best practices such as first-come, first-served processing, as well as expanding the use of individualized assessments to address barriers. We recommend setting a lower income ratio to address economic segregation and income inequalities, and low-impact look-back periods to screen for criminal histories, and low-impact credit conditions to screen for credit histories. So that brings us to the proposal package. Before we get into the details, it is important to note that while there are 2 distinct policies within this proposal, they are integral to each other and linked in very direct ways. When we were ready to bring our security deposit draft to council in the summer of 2017, we heard loud and clear from our community partners that we would be making housing access worse for people of color. Landlords use security deposits to offset their perceived risks, and some landlords, right now in the city, charge second chance tenants up to 5 times the rent for a deposit. We realize that making changes to what and how they make deposit claims would exacerbate screening discrimination. It is critical for this council to understand that one really needs the other to work effectively. We spent a lot of time discussing the data around screening criteria impacts, so it's important we take a moment to explain that there are significant barriers in security deposits as well. Ancillary income is a profit landlords make in addition to base rent and is a hot trend. This picture comes from a presentation given at the 2017 National Apartment Association Education Conference by a company called Entrata. They did a study of over 2 million apartment units and found that the number 5 source of ancillary income for landlords was in security deposits. In Portland, a lack of key regulations makes this ancillary income easier to come by. So let's start with deposit caps. There is no law in Oregon that limits the amount a landlord can charge for a security deposit. As explained earlier, those amounts can get shockingly high. Of the 25 states that set deposit caps, 22 states are between 1 time to 2 times a month's rent, 2 states are less than a month's rent, and 1 state is 3 times a month's rent. The other half of the states, including ours, is silent on the matter. Because state law gives explicit rights to landlords to charge both first and last month's rent, and because a deposit can also be used for last month's rent, we had to take a nuanced approach to the deposit caps. In total, a landlord can charge 1 to 2 times a month's rent total for a security deposit, depending on whether or not they include last month's rent, or if conditions, as identified in the screening process, warrant additional consideration of barriers. So including first month's rent, which is almost always required, total move-in cost won't exceed 2 times to 3 times a month's rent amount. And while that is still high, it is fairly typical in the country. State law gives explicit right to the landlord to charge for repair and replacement, but not actually do the repair or replacement. It literally states that. State law also does not require much in the way of accounting of actual damages to make claims against the deposit, except for an invoice due to the tenant 30 days after move out. We are recommending a more thorough process for tenants and landlords to agree upon what damage already exists in the unit at move-in through a condition report. The report is the baseline for any claims the landlord intends to make at the end of the tenancy. And in addition, the landlord must include pictures and proper evidence of labor charges when making claims for damage. State law mandates that landlords can only use deposits to cover unpaid rent or damages caused by the tenant, quote unquote, not including ordinary wear and tear. And that's about the extent of that explanation in state law. The common practice is to charge for full cleaning, often after cleaning is done by the tenant before move out, to charge to put on a fresh coat of paint, and to repair or replace items regardless of how the damage was caused, including worn out carpet. Additionally, landlords commonly charge full replacement of all carpets and hardwood floors when damage occurs in a single area because they want it to match. We are recommending a more complete definition of wear and tear that makes clear landlords cannot charge for items that weren't damaged intentionally or through misuse or neglect. In addition, we have eliminated the ability to charge for basic cleaning and for paint, except where it is needed to repair damage to a wall. We have also provided a provision that limits what they can charge for damaged flooring, containing it only to the room or area in which the damage occurred. We are also recommending that the amount charged must follow a reasonable depreciation schedule. In effect, landlords should only be allowed to charge for the actual value of the item, in other words, what they could have sold it for in its used condition at the time it was broken. We have not yet identified a specific depreciation schedule, so that is an area that will be decided in administrative rules if the policy passes and before implementation begins. State law requires only property management companies to keep security deposits in separate client accounts. In practice, landlords who are also not property managers often mix the deposits in their operating and personal funds. In fact, one private company who owns over 800 units told us directly that he always puts deposits in his operating budget, and we have since learned that he uses that budget to purchase additional properties. What that means is that landlords can be highly incentivized not to return any of the money because they are depending on it for other uses. Many other states require separate accounts and interest of a minimum amount paid to the tenant. We are recommending that landlords must put deposits in a separate account of their choice and can use the same separate account for all units. If they choose to use an interest-bearing account, that interest is due to the tenant upon move-out, minus an optional 5% admin fee. In addition, we are including new reporting requirements that are designed to assist tenants in providing evidence to their next landlord during the screening process. Before move-out, a landlord would need to provide a tenant with both a rental history form that follows specific conditions described in the screening criteria policy and also a payment accounting of the last 2 years to enable them to demonstrate the history of payments they made to their current landlord, since it's not reflected in credit. Both of these reports contain critical information that is often used to deny housing to tenants when former landlords do not respond to requests from screening companies. Now on to screening criteria. There is no state law requirements about how applications are processed or what information an application must provide to an applicant. In practice, smaller to medium-sized landlords typically take in many applications at a time and sift through them as they arrive until they find someone that they want. As the Fair Housing Audit demonstrated, the point at which an application is submitted is the primary intersection with discriminatory practices. Larger landlords and property managers often voluntarily use a first-come, first-served model as it is considered best practice to avoid fair housing claims. We are recommending a first-come, first-served approach for all landlords. The policy requires that landlords provide a receipt and queue number to applicants as completed applications are submitted and then process them in the order they were received. Nothing prevents a landlord from screening multiple applications at a time as long as they issue a determination in order. Because moving to a first-come, first-served system is inherently inequitable to some degree, we are recommending accountability mechanisms such as a 72-hour notification advertisement window before landlords accept applications for vacant units. This allows people who need to request time off from work, need translation assistance, have disabling conditions that require assistance, or need time to get their supplemental evidence gathered to have a shot at being the front of the line. The advertisement requirements also include notification about units that are fully accessible by ADA standards, and the preference policy allows individuals who need those units to be considered for them first if they apply within the first 8 hours of an open application period. Finally, we have created a unique heads of household definition that allows a group of adults to choose to live together to identify amongst themselves who will be the legal leaseholders responsible for paying the rent. This allows other adults to be screened on a more limited basis because they are not legally liable, but opens the door of greater access for multi-generational households, families who may have adult children with disabilities, and peoples whose income is so low they would never qualify on their own. This graph from Metro gives us a little insight into multi-generational households in Portland. As you can see, there are thousands of tenants in multi-generational households, and they are more likely to be households of color. State law gives explicit rights to screen for credit, eviction, and criminal history conditions, but does not specify the type of identification needed to acquire the information. Screening companies have told us that the only thing they need in order to establish identity is any document or combination of documents that matches the person's name with their face and their date of birth. Social Security numbers are only used for checking credit. We are recommending a wide variety of possible forms of identification to allow people without government-issued ID to enter into housing. We have also added a provision that landlords cannot reject an application due to a lack of Social Security number. If the landlord uses the low barrier criteria, which we'll explain in a little bit, it won't matter for checking credit because lack of credit is not a condition an applicant can be denied for. If the landlord adopts the individual assessment model, lack of credit becomes part of the consideration, and applicants can provide supplemental evidence about their credit conditions or a reasonable explanation of why they did not provide a Social Security number. State law does not mandate an income ratio, but in practice, most use the 3 times income ratio. But some landlords require an even higher ratio for their market rate apartments. Resource providers across the board have told us that income ratio is the biggest obstacle into market rate housing. This puts tremendous pressure on affordable housing provider resources, as well as creates economic segregation that impacts people of color the most. Also, people who have Section 8 vouchers have extreme difficulty finding market rate housing they can afford, and at least 25% are forced to give the voucher back, and at least half of all voucher holders are seniors and people with disabilities. We are recommending landlords cannot reject applicants who make at least 2 times the rent, or at least 2.5 times when 3 major utility costs are paid directly by the tenant. To compensate for the increased risk on future non-payments of rent, landlords can require either additional half-month security deposit taken in installments or a guarantor, or as Tyrone called it, a cosigner, when an applicant falls at 2 times the income ratio. This provides an additional assurance that the applicant has other resources to help them pay rent if they fall short. Additionally, for voucher holders, a landlord must subtract the voucher amount from the full rent amount before calculating the remaining ratio. And again, only heads of household would be screened for income, allowing other low-income tenants another opportunity to access housing. The concerns around lowering the income ratio are understandable, but at this point in time, there are no better answers. We have some organizations here who will speak to this in their testimony, but this infographic provided by Metro demonstrates the mismatch between units that are available and the incomes of people who need to access those units. As you can see, the number of units available to people who make 60% AMI or less is about half the number of people who need them. Lowering the income ratio allows us to ease some of this mismatch, which based on a previous map clearly demonstrates economic segregation, while also easing some of the resource burden put upon our limited affordable housing units. Okay, so let's talk about screening for barriers. Our proposed policy does not force landlords to rent to anyone or remove a landlord's purview over who lives on their property. It is against state law for us to do so. Rather, this policy simply asks landlords to choose their own screening process and provides the following 2 options. Option 1, adopt the low barrier set of criteria outlined in this code. This is a fast, simple way to screen as quickly and easily as the current system allows. This criteria is based on data that supports a more accurate and equitable assessment of what constitutes risk, quote unquote, in an applicant's history. Or option 2, adopt the individual assessment model. This allows landlords to choose whatever screening criteria they want, as allowed by state law, but if they intend to deny an applicant, landlords must consider any evidence the applicant supplied that demonstrates they have mitigated or improved any of the housing barriers that they are being denied for. For example, someone with an eviction on their record can show proof that they have held a steady job for a long time or that the eviction was based on conditions in their life that no longer exist. The landlord will still be empowered to make the final decision about if the applicant is right for their property. They just have to provide information to the prospective tenant about why they are being denied and what the specific business interest reason is that the landlord has determined as a basis for denial. This process is already outlined in HUD guidance and should be familiar to landlords. In fact, nothing about the individual assessment process should be new. We have simply codified in more explicit and objective terms how to conduct an individualized assessment and for what barriers. So while it may look confusing to people who have not been a landlord before or who are unfamiliar with the Fair Housing Act, this is something everyone should know well and be doing anyway. In fact, we believe that by codifying the process laid out in federal guidance, we are helping to educate landlords about what the Fair Housing Act says, and we are giving them a step-by-step process that, if followed, helps protect against discrimination claims. This is just good business practice. What does not exist now is any requirement that a landlord demonstrate they actually considered information an applicant may give them. So we created the notice of denial to serve this purpose. And on your screen is just an example of what that could look like. HUD's Office of General Guidance says, and I quote, "Thus, where a policy or practice that restricts access to housing has a disparate impact on individuals of a particular race, national origin, or other protected class, such policy or practice is unlawful under the Fair Housing Act if it is not necessary to serve a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interest of the housing provider, or if such interest could be served by another practice that has a less discriminatory effect. We are simply asking landlords to communicate the answer to 3 questions that follows HUD guidance. Number 1, what is the specific screening criteria barrier they are being denied for? Number 2, if supplemental evidence was provided, what part did it play in this analysis? And 3, based on the first 2 answers, what is the business interest non-discriminatory reason for denying the application? This protects landlords from false claims of discrimination and gives tenants the information they need to either improve or acquire the types of evidence they need to overcome their barriers into housing with their next application. The length of time it would take a landlord to follow the individual assessment model and the advertising requirements are largely within their control. This is a timeline that demonstrates just how quickly turnover can occur. Day 1 is when a landlord either issues a notice to vacate or a tenant issues a notice that they are moving. This is typically anywhere from a 30 to 90-day notice. However, there are 72-hour notices for eviction purposes and more rarely 24-hour notices for extreme circumstances. So for this timeline, we will assume a 72-hour notice. As soon as they know a unit will become available, a landlord can immediately identify an application period and begin advertising. For a 72-hour notice, that means screening may begin as soon as the unit is empty. But for longer notices, screening can begin long before the unit is available. In either circumstance, it takes time for a landlord to assess unit conditions, clean, and make repairs for the next tenant. In fact, our security deposit policy gives landlords up to a week to complete a final inspection, although they can do it much quicker. Landlords can start screening the minute they receive the first application, assuming it is not an accessible unit, which requires an 8-hour preference window. Because the individual assessment model requires tenants to provide any evidence they want considered at the time they submit their application, there is no additional time needed if they intend to deny and are mandated to do an assessment. What they are given is all they are required to use to assess. So screening companies, there are several screening companies locally who do a more manual process, and they've told us that they typically turn around applications in 3 business days. So maybe 5 days if it falls on a weekend. So there are a number of landlords who already have a lengthier screening process in place, and there are a number of screening companies who are already prepared to do this type of assessment. In the end, it is entirely reasonable to expect to be able to screen within a 3 to 5 day window, which is still only 4 to 6 days since the tenant moved out in this scenario, once applications are accepted. With a 72-hour notice, that can happen before the unit is even ready for the next tenant to move in. There's nothing in this policy that requires landlords to wait for postmarked mail or that assessments would have to be conducted one at a time. Multiple applications can be screened at the same time as long as the approval or denial is issued in the order they were received. In fact, if multiple applications are screened, that's better for them because landlords are explicitly allowed by policy to put those who are approved on a waiting list. Then when additional units open, they don't even have to advertise at all, as long as the waiting list follows the order in which the applications were received. These are the conditions of the low barrier criteria that we are encouraging all landlords to voluntarily adopt. As you can see, it is meant to represent what research and best practices tell us about what constitutes true risk in a potential tenant. The credit conditions focus on lowered amounts of debt and credit scores. Rental history focuses on establishing more recent patterns of specific behaviors, and criminal history conditions focus on judgments that have shown to not increase negative housing outcomes. You may also note that the look-back periods are based more on recidivism research as opposed to the even earlier look-back outcomes of the recent housing study. The length of time it takes for a landlord to follow the low barrier model is even quicker than the assessment model. We expect applicants can be screened for acceptance or denial on the very first day of the open application period, or possibly the next day if it is an accessible unit. In a 72-hour notice scenario, this is only 1 or 2 days after move out, and the unit is likely not even ready for the next tenant. State law currently requires landlords to only charge what is reasonable or what the screening company they use is charging. They must also return fees within 2 weeks if not used to screen an applicant. However, many do not follow this requirement because state law can be misinterpreted. It takes an applicant an average of 4 paid fees before they are approved, and that number is higher for people of color, and average fees are anywhere from $40 to $60 per adult, but some are as high as $100. We are recommending a more nuanced approach to fees based on the feedback that the new policy may incentivize landlords to bring some of the assessment in-house. We have identified percentages that can be charged depending on the type of screening process the landlord adopts. We have also made explicit when fees must be returned. For landlords who use the lengthier assessment model only, screening companies have told us they may have to increase their fees by $20 or so, or offer it as an additional service on a case-by-case basis. Since we know that the average applicant pays for screening fees before they are accepted into housing, but we believe the fee schedule in combination with other parts of the policy, like the first come, first serve, notice of denial information, notice of rights and requirements, et cetera, we believe it will reduce the average number of fees paid by at least half. So because we are reducing the number of fees paid, this will not result in a net increased cost for applicants and will actually result in a decreased net cost for those who apply to units using a low barrier model. We're getting to the end, I promise. At least of me talking. We have included a few very important exemptions. First, there are a number of ways in which resource providers and landlords have developed direct relationships and created agreements for placement preferences for vulnerable tenants. We do not want to interfere with those relationships as they serve the best interests of the tenants. Exemptions also include landlords and sublessors who share the residence, units that are rented privately, and any funding or loan requirements that mandate specific screening would supersede the parts of the policy in direct conflict with theirs.
Jamie, I'm going to get in trouble with the sponsor, but this is such an important screen. This goes to one of the questions that I had with your dispensation. Council set a goal of 2,000 units of permanent supportive housing. Council has policies regarding foster kids and intergenerational housing. We support providers to do refugee resettlement, and then domestic violence survivors go to the head of the line in certain cases. Would those all potentially be covered under formal agreements that have a different set of rules than what we're currently proposing?
Yes, so the intention is if there are specific formal arrangements between somebody trying to place vulnerable tenants into housing and somebody who's providing units for those vulnerable tenants, that they would be exempted from the policy as a whole.
Thank you.
And finally, the best part. I'm so excited to get to this moment. We wrapped up our development of this policy by conducting a beta test with affordable housing providers, market rate providers, legal advocates, and resource advocates. We focused on case studies of real tenants that we used to conduct mock screenings. That helped us to identify any ways in which the policy was cumbersome or had legal or administrative issues. From those screenings, we were able to make final adjustments to the policy. But the most interesting part of the beta test was the data analysis. We were extremely lucky to contract with Dr. Lisa Bates, who is well known to the city and nationally for her research on displacement and racial justice. And Dr. Bates is here to explain the results of that analysis as a conclusion to our presentation. Dr. Bates, it is time for me to be quiet and for you to...
Excuse me, Mayor. Before Dr. Bates speaks, I just wanted to say that if we all look angry, it's because there's this white noise that's beating down on us, and it's causing a severe headache. So it has nothing to do with anything that anybody is saying or anybody that's in the audience. I just want you to know that we are suffering in silence here because this is such an important issue, okay?
I'm really relieved to hear that because I wasn't quite sure. I was the one talking the whole time.
So also as the presiding officer, I'm the bearer of bad news. We are approximately halfway through today's work session, and I understand there are 5 panels, and we are not through the first panel yet. So I just want to put a time check out there.
Each of the panelists have been asked to keep their remarks to about 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Moving forward.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Where is it? Oh, there it is.
All right, great. Thank you so much. As Jamie described, my name is Lisa Bates. I have a PhD in city and regional planning with expertise in housing policy and economics. And it's on that basis, which I was contracted by Commissioner Udaley's office to provide some data analysis for what we described as a beta test to simulate the outcomes of screening That beta test included a number of meetings with landlords and providers and property managers to think about individualized applications, and also this larger data test, which is what I'm going to describe today, using the tenant data from the One App platform. So approximately 5,800 tenant applications that were submitted as of January. This is an analysis of the non-income to rent ratio criteria in the policy. So it does not include the income to rent ratio, because that of course would be very specific to a unit and a price. But this allows us to understand how other kinds of rental history experiences for applicants may affect their ability to gain housing. So just to give a general sense of this applicant data, this is not a statistically representative random sample data set, but it is a large database of tenant applicants that have a variety of characteristics that allow us to test for different kinds of tenant screening barriers. So there's a gender and racial diversity, there's a fairly wide income range, including a substantial number of lower income households in the data set. And we do have, if you'll advance the slide, a number of folks who have the kinds of challenges to housing access that we were interested in thinking about whether or not the policy proposal would change their ability to gain access to housing, including housing choice vouchers, a history of eviction filings, a history of criminal justice system contact, or having no rental history at all reported. So sort of newer household formed with no rental history. There's also about a quarter of the folks in the database do not have a credit history that is recorded and have a mean credit score just over 600, but with a substantial number of folks less than 600. So just to give some visual representation here, to see the difference between a standard industry practice and the fair proposal, the folks who fall in between these two orange lines would be those captured by changed standards on eviction filing. To give a sense, again, in this data set of the number or the proportion of people who have had contact with the criminal justice system in terms of convictions, this is the number. It's a small number, and most of those folks would fall into the over 7-year range of past history. For credit scores, again, we have a pretty significant number of folks with an under 600 credit score, with 600 being a baseline in many of the industry standard operating procedures. And rental history, again, will be a barrier for a substantial number of people who do not have a reported rental history for whatever reason. So in terms of looking at these outcomes, essentially what I've done is simulate the screening, giving folks a sort of yes, no, or an indeterminate across 4 policies. This policy proposal, the standard screening provided by Multifamily Northwest, provided by another private industry group, and one provided by Central City Concern to represent an affordable housing provider's version. So we looked at all tenants across all 4 policies, and then tried to drill down on some specific groups of persons with issues or backgrounds that were flagged as having particular concern. So again, noting we do not have income to rent ratios here, so these are folks passing the screening based on other kinds of rental history barriers. And there are some indeterminate outcomes because we do not have full data for some issues. So as an example, in speaking with Tyrone about the data, the information on a felony versus a misdemeanor conviction is not particularly reliable because of differences from state to state in terms of what activities are charged and in what ways. So there's a number of people who end up in an indeterminate category because their charge falls within a time span that is in the look back, but we don't know whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony. So that would be one example. So our high-level analysis is that approximately 4,000 people would be approved on the criteria in the FAIR policy under this new proposal out of about 5,900 people altogether. There is a substantial shift in outcomes, particularly for private market rental screening policies. So here, looking at the 2 private rental screening policies that we tested, there is a pretty significant shift from outright denial into approval under the policy proposal. So if we look at what drives those different outcomes, it is largely credit history and rental history. So in taking a look through our conversations with the committee, the advisory group, I was able to assess and analyze the relationship between credit history and eviction filing and found no relationship statistically in this data set. For rental history, of course, if you have no months reported rental history, you don't have an eviction history. But that sort of indicates, I think, the catch-22. How do you get a rental history if you don't already have a rental history, if rental history is required to be screened? So those are the 2 most substantial drivers in terms of these numbers. We've talked a lot in the conversation about eviction and criminal justice contact history as issues of concern, but those are very small numbers relatively in the data set, right? About 600 folks with an eviction history, just over 500 with a criminal justice history. So this shift to approval is not largely driven by either of those characteristics. It is largely driven by credit and rental history criteria. It's also the case, I'll note that both of the market provider policies as written indicate that there are opportunities for additional individualized screening that may be available under unclear circumstances based on the written policy. So this is an analysis simply taking at face value their baseline rules. But they have some pathways apparently available under some unclear circumstances that may allow more people to have access. The FAIR policy proposal in looking at outcomes looks most like, and in fact very similar to, Central City Concern as an affordable housing provider's policy. So the kinds of practices of those providers would be similar to this policy. Overall, from 1/3 to 1/2 of the applicants with data in this data set are newly approved with the FAIR policy as compared to current industry standard operating procedure. We did drill down and look at some groups of concern, and again, I would caution these are not very large numbers of subpopulations, but these are the sort of the data that we have and we're able to use to understand what this market looks like. So if we look at the screening criteria for applicants who report using a voucher, housing choice voucher, or commonly known as Section 8, there is a significant shift into an approval for folks who have vouchers. To be clear, having a voucher is not itself a criteria for the screening, but the other characteristics that people have regarding, for example, their credit score, that correlate highly with having a voucher, which is for low-income folks, are the things that block people with vouchers from these written screening policies. Second, we looked at those tenant applicants with low to moderate incomes. And again, those same kinds of correlating characteristics around credit history, rental history, et cetera, allow many more of those households to shift into the approved category. For those with a criminal justice contact history, we have a substantial shift. There are still a number of folks, and again, this is out of 530 individuals who have a history of criminal justice contact in the database, who are in an indeterminate category. But this allows access where there would have been essentially no access available baseline. And finally, to connect to the conversation around fair housing and discrimination, this policy provides substantially greater access for folks who identify as people of color in this database. Jamie described, I think, at some length the relationship of race with credit score, as well as other economic indicators that are connected in differential treatment in terms of eviction, criminal justice contact, et cetera, that would all lead to a greater likelihood of a rejection in the current standard operating procedures. So again, to sort of conclude, our simulated test increased access for somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of renter applicants as compared to current industry standard operating procedures. The outcomes are similar to the kind of screening that happens with affordable housing providers now, folks who are, of course, dedicated to providing access to folks with lower incomes. And this policy would increase the acceptance rate on the criteria of rental history barriers for people of color, low-income applicants, and those with housing choice vouchers.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes our presentation. Colleagues, questions?
Commissioner Fisher.
Thank you. Jamie Duhamel, I have a number of questions I'd like to just pose to you. And if you don't have an answer readily available, I'm happy to get an email or talk to you after today's hearing. What is our best estimate of the number of rental units in the city of Portland?
Oh, gosh.
I had the number of 124,472.
I think that's
Culled
correct.
from some documents that we were given, but is that in the ballpark?
I think that's in the ballpark, yes.
And do we know, off of that data, what the distribution is as between small, medium, and large landlords?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a registration in the city of Portland, so I think I don't know if the Housing Bureau has guesses around that, but we don't actually have any direct data.
What is the status of the landlord registry?
You would have to ask the Housing Bureau that question, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Or I can find it for you and provide it later.
So I have a couple of questions which I'm going to put under the heading, what does success look like? In the first year of this program, what do you guesstimate will be the cost of administration on the city side?
Well, we issued a directive to get that analysis. Based on what the Housing Bureau has provided, they believe that the delayed implementation plan could cost around $500,000. That's largely because there is no registration process. They would need to direct mail all landlords and I think tenants. They have a training plan. They have to turn forms, they have to do interpret forms into multiple languages. There's a lot of work that needs to happen. So their guess is around $500,000 for that delayed implementation plan, and then a little over $400,000 annually to pay for 2 increased staff members. Their analysis suggests that the policy will require a great amount of interaction between the Housing Bureau and landlords and tenants as they learn the policy and adapt to the new regulations.
So with those numbers, which I'll just say roughly comes to roughly $1 million for this year of one time and ongoing, that puts a a fair amount of pressure on the budget discussions, which we are in the process of having. The mayor comes out with his proposed budget in May. In terms of, again, what does success look like? If you are unsuccessful in getting the $500,000 and the $400,000 annually in year one, does that effectively mean that that this would have to be delayed as to when it kicks in?
So I want to clarify a little bit. It is my understanding, based on the analysis, it would not be $1 million at once. It's $500,000 for this budget year, and then moving forward, additional budget years, it would be over $400,000.
Okay.
So it's not $1 million at once.
Okay. But I'm going to be a pessimist for a moment. We have less than $2 million of ongoing money to carve up, and probably when the dust settles, somewhere around $7 million in one time. And we have a rather robust set of asks that the council has put in. If you are unsuccessful in getting the additional resources you need to get this thing up and running, does that effectively push off the implementation date?
It could push off the implementation date. I think that there's nothing within this policy that requires a dollar amount. How we move forward with implementation is fully within our control, and I think there's a wide variety of circumstances that we can, or scenarios that we can come up with if we can't get the full amount as requested by the Housing Bureau. But if it requires, so our recommendation is that we implement by October 1st, 2019, to give 6 months for training and information to be provided to landlords and tenants. If we need to push that off to January 1st, that's certainly a consideration that we can take up.
A couple other questions. How long do you anticipate it will take to develop administrative rules?
That would also be a question for the Housing Bureau.
Okay. And one of the features of this law is that a tenant that feels aggrieved can go get a private attorney or get an attorney to bring an action for damages and can recover his or her attorney fees. What is your sense of the availability of lawyers to help enforce the terms of this law?
Well, we've been working very closely with legal advocates who represent low-income tenants and tenants at large. So the Fair Housing Council is fully prepared. The Legal Aid and Oregon Law Center have been fully involved and understand the policy deeply. So we anticipate that they will be ready and willing and available to assist tenants as these kind of issues of conflict and clarification of policy present themselves. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, they're already pretty strained in terms of providing services to people.
Sure.
The question will ultimately be one of whether the private bar steps up and is willing to take these cases. I see Alan Lazo nodding his head affirmatively, so affirmatively nodding his head. Just, it's not. I don't know whether historically we've always been able to count on the private bar to take their fair share for these kinds of cases, but that would be the principal enforcement mechanism, correct? Correct.
We would, our long-term vision is that we would be able to in-house enforcement of these policies. We think long-term it has better outcomes for tenants and for landlords if the city can take it out of the court system. Unfortunately, because we don't have a registration system and we also don't have a licensing program, we have no authority to enforce or issue fees or fines to the landlord industry as a whole. So right now, it exclusively lives in the court system, just like state landlord-tenant law. We tried to find a good balance in the damages part of this policy that would disincentivize landlords from violating the policy and also incentivize private attorneys and tenants to pursue their rights. Because it is often the case that for tenants, the time and cost and intimidation around going to court to pursue their rights is too much for them to bear. So we definitely tried to strike a balance.
My last question is, looking nationally, what are some of the cities that have tried all or a part of this proposal? And what can we learn from the record that they've had implementing similar proposals?
So the policy that we are presenting to you today does not exist in form anywhere else in the country. However, there are two jurisdictions in which we took some inspiration, I would say. So the first is the New Orleans public housing model, where they have developed a pretty specific criteria, nuanced kind of chart about when to do individualized assessments based on criminal history. So theirs is pretty nuanced and laid out. So if a crime, of a certain type was committed at a certain time, you move on to assessment. If a different crime of a different type, of a different time frame, you don't do an assessment. We decided not to take that very complicated approach because we are trying to get private landlords to engage in a low barrier criteria. In addition, Seattle, a couple years ago, tried to do a similar policy. In fact, a staff with Central City Concern was one of the folks who helped create that policy, and she's been very informative in the development of this policy as well. They attempted a first-come, first-served policy that would not allow landlords to deny housing for particular criminal histories. That part of the policy, is my understanding, was overturned in their state court. I think the judgment was that it was a takings of private property. It violated their state constitution for private property rights. Our state constitution, I believe, is interpreted differently, and we intentionally built our policy to not fall into the same legal traps as the Seattle model.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Fritz.
First, thank you all for your presentation, and thank you for all of your work over many, many months. I recognize it's been a lot, especially Jamie G. Hamill. Thank you for your leadership on this. Just some clarifying questions. You said that this doesn't apply to units not available to the general public, and I think you said units rented privately. What does that mean?
That means landlords can rent their property to whomever they want. So if they turn to their sister or their neighbor and say, do you want my property, they can do so. Whenever a landlord engages with the public is when this policy would be triggered. So if they issue any kind of advertisement, whether that's a sign to the general public, whether that's on Craigslist, if they are saying to the general public, anyone can apply and I will consider you, that's publicly advertising.
Okay, so it's actually related to advertising. So
Correct.
if you don't advertise, you don't have to follow any of this policy.
If you try to rent by word of mouth, if you rent to your friends or family directly, correct.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. Tyrone, thank you for your presentation and for all your work. Did I correctly hear you that 20% of properties are not managed by property management companies?
No. Actually, 60% of all of 60% of all housing is not fee managed. So it's just mom and pop owned.
60%?
60%. What I was saying was the 80-20 rule doesn't apply in the housing space. Right.
I'm glad I clarified. So then, has there been consideration of mom and pop dealing with some of these social service issues? They're helping people out when they can't pay their rent, the criminal checks, etc. You're taking drugs and I'm going to help you.
Can you repeat that question one more time?
Well, you gave some examples of where property managers have been able to help people spread out payments over several months, or the one who knows all the parole officers and is able to tell whether they're...
That is completely irrelevant to this policy. We are not asking private market landlords to provide supportive services. And the example that Tyrone gave...
That's not what I was trying to convey. It was a miscommunication on that. All I was trying to convey was that in order for the policy to be successful, it has to have property management company buy-in. That's all
But what's about the 60% that don't use a property management company?
That's not what that was about. I was saying 80% of the market and 20% rule. So basically, the majority of the fee-managed marketplace is spread out over a ton of small companies. That's what I was conveying.
I understand. Thank you. That's helpful. And then my last question, and back to Jamie, is the housing director going to be presenting today?
I do not believe so, no.
So I think Commissioner Fish's question, several of the answers were that's the Housing Bureau's issue. When will we get that information?
So I believe they are here in the room and available to answer questions directly if you want them to, but they're not part of the invited testimony panels. But they are here to answer questions.
Thank you.
We've also delayed the vote for one additional week so that council has plenty of time to
That's
have
such-
the conversation.
I've filed an absence for that week. I'm out on city business.
Okay.
So I think we need
For the
to
17th?
Yes.
Commissioner Hardesty?
Thank you. My question is, how do people with a previous felony conviction rent properties today?
They don't. So there is a large number of people, justice-involved individuals, who cope through other mechanisms. They are either couch surfing, a few of them receive resources through Southeast Works. In fact, there is a representative of Southeast Works here who can probably answer more directly what people who are transitioning out of incarceration experience about getting into housing. So it is a needle in a haystack, and there is very little access for them.
And currently, do we have prohibitions against people who've been convicted of crimes, sexual crimes, from living anywhere in the city of Portland?
Do we have prohibitions? So there's a wide latitude on what each individual landlord sets as their individual criteria. There's no standardization around that. So I think there's a large number of landlords who have just direct bans on specific types of crimes that they feel create an increased risk for tenancies. So sexual crimes, I think, is one of those particular ones that see outright bans across the board.
I'm asking these questions in a very facetious way because I really do know the answer to. I know that we have sex offenders living in every neighborhood right now. And so I've gotten a lot of fear-based emails from people that if we pass these laws, then all of a sudden our neighborhoods are going to be overflowing with people who are sex offenders and murderers and rapists. And I just wanted to put it on the record. I wanted the invited testimony to put on the record that murderers and rapists and sex offenders are living in our neighborhoods today. Is that correct?
They're living in ways where the neighborhood doesn't know, right? So they are forced to kind of access housing in underground ways. So they are either, they're buying homes, they're living with friends and family. They are not,
Leaseholders.
what's that?
They're not
Leaseholders.
leaseholders.
Right.
And my last question has to do with, my last question I just forgot, having a headache and sitting under this white noise. It'll come back to me. Thank you all for your testimony. I'm greatly appreciative, and I'm really appreciative of the hard work that you've done. And Dr. Bates, you've been at this for a long time. You look like you're 12, but I know you've been doing this for a long time. Thank you so much.
It was the glamour shot that we put in the PowerPoint. I just want to follow up very briefly on the criminal history question. Different crimes come, sorry, I'm speaking to you, Commissioner Hardesty. Different crimes come with different conditions of release, and this policy would in no way supersede those conditions of release. So if a condition is you can't live within 500 feet of a school, or you can't spend time in an area where children are prevalent, our policy does not supersede that whatsoever. But what we have been hearing, there's no limit to how far a landlord can look back. And I think the testimony that I shared in my opening remarks is a good example of someone who committed a crime as a young person and has served their time, earned a master's degree, developed a credit score above 700, and regardless of how many years go by, that prior conviction is still being used against them. I personally know people who have had convictions that are decades old. We have plenty of community members who have cannabis convictions that would actually no longer be crimes, and they are being screened out of the renter pool for no legitimate reason, no legitimate fact-based reason. It's simply fear and prejudice.
And I want wanted to point out to the council, if you don't mind, as our kind of final thing, that we provided you supplemental materials, and in there is also a memo around our response to the question about, should we be giving different consideration to offenders who have committed extreme crimes in the past. There's just a wide variety of reasoning about why it's not a good idea to separate and segregate those criminal offenders and by types of offense. And I also want to just put on the record that the Vera Institute of Justice makes a really compelling argument that we are all safer as a community and as neighborhoods when we invest in formerly incarcerated adults' stability, because when they can access the basic needs of life, like housing and jobs, the opportunities for them to reoffend or the incentives for them to offend drop dramatically, that it is incumbent upon us to make sure that they are stable so the neighborhoods as a whole are safer.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Commissioner Udaley. As a former state legislator who was there when Measure 11 passed, and understand that in this state, young people get convicted for sex offenses if there's a 3-year difference in the age. So there are a lot of changes that we must make to make our criminal justice system more fair. And so I really appreciate the work that you've done in your due diligence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I mean, we did hear pretty compelling testimony last night at our budget hearing from a young man who had spent 7.5 years in prison due to a Measure 11 offense. And like the person I shared testimony from has just encountered one barrier after another to housing and employment. We are setting people up for failure when they come back into community, therefore setting our communities up for greater harm. And like I said, it's such a thorny issue. It cannot be solved through policymaking alone, but it's something that we really can't turn our backs on.
Very good. I just have a couple of questions, and I just want to sort of level set from my own perspective. You mentioned, Jamie, this is your 33rd draft. First of all, I admire your tenacity, but I also want to be honest. As I look at this, it is very complicated for me, and I'm going to need time to really digest this and understand the testimony and go away and have a number of conversations. So I just want to be very clear about that as I ask questions. And as people wonder maybe why I'm sitting here a little more silently than usual, it's because I'm really trying hard to understand all the nuances of this. I had one question for Mr. Poole, and again, I admire your leadership and the courage you took in being an entrepreneur, and I'm cheering for you. So first of all, thanks for coming back to City Hall. I had something you said haunted me a little bit. You said something to the effect that management companies are not set up to manage these criteria. What did you mean by that?
And I think that was misinterpreted when I was, because I know you said it didn't really fall into line, but what I was trying to convey is that after doing the research outside of data, actually working with management companies that were taking on these renters that we are, that need different types of supports, the majority of management companies don't have these solutions in play. So my fear is that to make sure that, one thing is to get these management companies to get renters in the door. And if that's success to you, then this policy will actually do that perfectly. But the only fear that I see with the policy is that if they get in the door to management companies that are not set up to take on their unique characteristics, then we will have problems. And when you see what management companies are doing that are doing this very well, and you look at the average management company, you will find that there's huge discrepancies on what they offer and what the renters need in management companies that are doing it well. So that's why my only fear that I want to bring up, because I want to make sure I show both sides. Yes, the policy will do really well with access, but if there are not, the management companies play a huge role in the success of a renter. And that you just have to understand that if you send rent burden families into a property, if you send any different types that they are not already taking, then they have to adjust to make sure that that family is successful. It is not a unilateral thing that takes place. That's all I was trying to communicate.
And I appreciate that, and that is actually a question I have that we don't need to answer today, but as I listen to ongoing testimony and we have the opportunity to digest this, I appreciate Dr. Bates' analysis and her clarity with regard to the assumptions and the potential incomplete nature of some of the data sets that went into it, and I appreciate it that you were clear on that point. I actually agree that if we lower the criteria on the front, the question is actually not just about the landlords, our question's about the tenants. And I want to hear about their relative likelihood of success. If we lower the barriers to entry, I want to know about their success down the road. My concern would be at the outset that if people are able to access the units, which is great, we should all applaud that, but the question is then, do they have the income level and the support structure they need to actually stay in that unit, or are we intentionally putting people into a position where we are effectively setting them up to fail? And there are consequences to failure in this model. If people are not successful in those units and they are evicted, under our reload ordinance, which I supported and I continue to support, they would be evicted for cause. And that means they would no longer be eligible for reload, and they would have an eviction on their record, which makes it harder the next time they want to rent a unit. So that's just something I'm putting out there, is something I'm interested in. And my usual budget wet blanket note, I appreciate Commissioner Fish raising the question. I remind folks we only have 1.7 million in ongoing and about 7 million in one time only. We have lots of priorities, not the least of which are the projects we've already told the Housing Bureau we expect them to execute on, like the rental registration system. And we could be using local data if we had a fully functional rental registration system with the data collection, but we do not have that yet. So we're still relying on data from other places to be able to inform our decisions here. And I just want to put a marker out there that it is a priority for me as the housing commissioner to make good on the promises we've already made. I'm concerned that if we go down this road and not be very clear about our budget situation, we might be setting up a situation where people have expectations about our ability to deliver on a new system that we in fact won't fund or may not fund unless we rearrange our priorities as a city council. So my usual wet blanket statement, I'm not saying it's specific to this. I say this in many council hearings on many subjects, that we have limited resources going forward in the Housing Bureau.
One more question.
Yes, Commissioner Hardesty.
Do we have any data on how many tenants are cost burdened today? I know the Community Alliance of Tenants is in the audience, and I suspect they're going to be testifying soon. Is that a question that I should hold until are they part of the invited testimony today? I'm sorry? Okay, excellent. Then I will take my question back and wait for the privilege of hearing it. Because what I believe and what I've seen is that many people already are paying much more than 30% of their income for rent today. So it's not like this proposal will overburden people who are already overburdened. And so I'm looking forward to getting that real data. Thanks.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fish.
So Jamie, I have one last question for you. We're hearing from a lot of people in the community about this, and I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the skeptics out there that are worried we may be overreaching, and it may be that a year from now we learn that despite our best intentions, we've made the situation worse, or we've created other barriers, or it's not working very well. So what is your plan to do a checkup on this legislation? Who would have that oversight role? And what would be the council's role?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Fish. We had always intended this policy to be a living document. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. We are leading the way and taking some pretty bold steps to address discrimination. We should be proud of that. But what it means is that we don't necessarily have all the answers today. This is the best case scenario that we know based on research and best practice. What our intention has always been is that the Housing Bureau would be given administrative rulemaking to adjust the policy as needed, and that commissions like the Rental Services Commission would be tasked with the opportunity to evaluate the policy, offer suggestions, and adaptations as they go. We are certainly open if any of the commissioners want to make a formal suggestion that there's an annual report or a biannual report. That is entirely up to you. But we believe the Housing Bureau will have the ability and authority to make adjustments to the policy as they determine, if unintended consequences occur.
So before I introduce our,
Could I ask one more question? It's a quick question. I want to make sure I understand this. I think I do. Vouchers, SNAP, and the like, is that or is that not included in the income?
That is included in income.
That
for a
is
renter.
included income. Does that raise any concerns?
Can you
that-
clarify your question? I'm sorry.
Are federal SNAP food vouchers qualifying
considered
income?
money-like, yes, so it's.
But you
it
can't
can
actually
be
spend that
factored.
on rent. You're using that for food, right?
But it
No.
increases your available income.
Household.
The way the policy is written now, it doesn't take into account additional food stamps and those kind of supplementary resources.
It does not include
It does
that.
not.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Commissioner Daly.
But I'm reading from Tyrone that people can include those
Yeah, I
types
mean,
of.
when you are applying to a property,
Yeah.
that all counts as income.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
your
it is included.
Yes, when you apply to a
Yeah.
property,
Yeah.
all of
Okay, so
those
the
are
final
income
answer
sources.
is, it is included in the income calculation.
Yes, to every single
qualify for a
management company
unit.
in Oregon.
Got it now.
And then I
Thank you.
believe with a voucher, you would take the value of that voucher off the total rent, and then you would base the income to rent ratio on the remaining
Yes, the
balance.
multiplier
Right,
would be
okay.
based on the remaining portion.
So before we move on to the next panel, I just want to thank all of you for your amazing work. Dr. Bates, I might have to go back to school just to take classes from you.
She'll be hard teacher.
Jamie, I'm so proud of you, and I'm really looking forward to you getting to work on something else. Tyrone, you bring such incredible insight to this conversation, and what you're doing is just mind-blowingly innovative. I do want to repeat what I said earlier, though. You brought up Mo, who owns Stark Firs, who's an amazing landlord. He is working with second chance tenants. He is working with people who are placing these tenants. It's really important for us to distinguish between a landlord like Mo and the rest of the private market. We are not asking private market landlords to take on tenants that require supportive services. We're just not.
Right.
That would be, let me finish.
Yes.
That would be a substantial change in their business model, and it would not be a reasonable accommodation. What I want to make sure everyone understands is 50% of renters in Portland are spending over 30% of their income on housing costs currently, and sorry to steal your thunder, Katrina, but half of them are spending 50% or more. That is roughly 125,000 people, I think, give or take a few, who live in cost-burden households. They are stable, by and large, in their housing because they are prioritizing rent. And I was one of those tenants for many, many years, and a few years of spending over 50% of my income. So I would be an interesting case study for this policy, because I'm now someone who earns well over median family income, who could not rent from a property management company, because my credit score is too low, because of the really hard choices that I've had to make in the several years leading up to my employment by the city of Portland to keep a roof over my head. So I can speak to this personally, and I just want to reassure everyone in the room, we are not asking private market landlords to become supportive housing providers. So I want to call up our next panel. We have...
Thank you.
Thank you. Katrina Holland from Community Alliance of Tenants, Alan Lazo from Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and Deborah MC from Multifamily Northwest. Yes. Please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, less if possible, so we can get out of here around the time we anticipated. And we're going to begin with Katrina. Welcome.
There we go. Got to push the button.
Oh, we have a request.
No, I'm fine.
Oh, okay, all right,
Carla
never
was
mind.
asking whether she should put people on a 5-minute clock.
Oh, please
Sure.
don't.
No,
Uh-uh.
I
I'ma
love,
try.
you know I love that buzzer. We could have used one last night.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Katrina Holland. I have the honor and privilege of serving as Executive Director of Community Alliance of Tenants, a renters' rights organization that's been fighting for balance to the landlord-tenant relationship for the last 22, almost 23 years. As a participant in crafting this policy, I am excited today to sit here during Fair Housing Month and know that after almost a decade of bringing up concerns about housing via addressing private market screening practices and security deposits, we are finally having a robust conversation about what those steps forward look like. So thank you, Commissioner Daly, for your leadership, and thank you, council members, for making this conversation possible. First and foremost, I want to address a few misconceptions about this policy. Number one, this policy is not intended to solve for the millions of reasons and causes of socioeconomic inequality. The solutions to these problems are complex and have been discussed for generations to no avail. So knowing that these solutions cannot begin to manifest tomorrow, we must do the best we can to address the damages of racisms, otherisms, and socioeconomic inequality today, as people are barred from housing access today in a crisis in these bases. This policy is designed to make discriminatory, intentional and unintentional screening practices harder to do and get away with. This policy is designed to encourage transparency in the screening and security deposit processes, mandating open and structured conversation between landlords and tenants. And this policy is designed to increase housing access to fair housing protected classes that the beta test has demonstrated, that have time and again been proven to have less access to private market housing, for which market rate and affordable housing development will not meet the need in the near future. Number two, this policy does not limit a landlord's ability to screen people with criminal histories, as we've heard over and over. This is a twisted, fear-mongering tactic that has been used to scare people into thinking they are unsafe. People have gone so low as to label existing residents in an email that we got from one of our tenants as quote-unquote future targets of domestic violence and sexual assault. For everyone who is here today who received a robocall or an email stating this assertion, it is factually untrue. This policy outlines a careful and intentional process for how screening of folks with criminal histories are to be screened, which is a mandate of federal law and guidance as of 2016. The truth of the matter is, individualized assessments have been a guidance given from the federal government for the last several years. So no, City Council is not voting to limit the ability of landlords to screen people with criminal histories, nor mandate approval of their applications. If the City Council were doing that, as Jamie stated earlier, they would be violating the law. These are lies and fear-mongering tactics at their ugliest that prey upon stereotypes and misconceptions of members of our community based on skin color and other appearance characteristics. So please, folks who have gotten those emails and phone calls, do not believe the hype. The truth of the matter is, you could have someone with a criminal history living next to you today, and you wouldn't even know it. The policy is designed to address and curb discriminatory practices that have disproportionately affected communities of color for many, many years due to the criminal justice system. This policy will place people, number 3, this policy will place people in harm's way, asking the private market to rent to people who only make 2 times the monthly rent. The reality is that the majority of Portland residents are renters, or almost the majority. The majority of these renters are rent burdened. Over half of those who are rent burdened are paying over half of their income on rent, according to recent data. In other words, they are extremely rent burdened. To Commissioner Udaley's point earlier, private market landlords are already providing this housing to these people without the supports. People are already living this reality both in private market and in the affordable housing market. So let's talk numbers to your question. According to the 2017 5-year ACS estimates, 46.6% of households, which we know is an undercount, in Portland are renters. So that is approximately 115,949 people. Of that number, approximately 110,426 households were computed for rent burden. 52.5% of renters are rent burdened, or approximately 57,974 renters. 25% are extremely rent burdened, or about 27,607 renters. In June 2018, 457 FEDs were filed in Multnomah County Courthouse. Approximately 80, I'm sorry?
What was that acronym? What does that mean?
Forcible entry and detainer. So basically evictions in the courthouse. Approximately 84% of those were for non-payment of rent, or about 384 cases. If we assume each person was extremely rent burdened, that is 1.4% of extremely rent burdened renters in the market now. If we assume that they are all rent burdened, that is only 0.67 of these people that have faced eviction for non-payment of rent. In other words, the volume of folks being run through the evictions court system for non-payment of rent doesn't even come close to the number of people who are already extremely rent burdened or characterized as regularly rent burdened. This assumption comes from a myth that low-income people can't handle their budgets, when in fact, hundreds or thousands of people can handle their budgets. People with low to moderate incomes have been making these hard choices for years, and in one case we know of, for decades. This policy is designed to attempt to increase housing access for families who are rent burdened instead of segregating them into certain corners of our city or out of the city entirely, which is the case now and is a fair housing concern. This isn't about a phone or a car or even a loan. This is a basic human need. This is about a commitment that the city has made to becoming a city committed to housing first. So why should the majority of our housing market be left out of that commitment? Number 4, this policy will limit landlords' ability to choose who they want to live in their homes. As Jamie beautifully stated, this policy is designed to balance out the power dynamics between landlord and tenant. When a landlord makes the choice to make their property available to the public, there should be a set of rules for engagement. As it currently stands, and as fair housing testing reports demonstrate, housing discrimination runs rampant for folks of varying national origins and races. There are too many loopholes property owners can use to screen someone out just because they choose to play the roles of national security officers, judge, jury, and executioners, and/or loan officers. The policy simply outlines a process by which property managers must screen prospective tenants if they choose more restrictive criteria than the safe harbor standard the policy outlines. The choice is still theirs. They must be transparent in their decision-making and make known to the tenant, or as we say, show receipts, for choosing to deny someone access to a home. This is not a limitation. This is increasing transparency, a practice that both tenants and property managers will benefit from. Number 5, this policy is not good because it doesn't create any more units. It does not create units, but it does create greater access and choice for many people currently barred from many units in our market. We know a woman who has moved 6 times in the last 2 years. Each time, she has been rent burdened. Each time she was preparing to move, she was threatened with homelessness due to a lack of housing choice. She said this policy gives her hope because it will increase her chances of finding a place to live instead of potentially facing homelessness due to less choices. She has never had an FED filed against her for non-payment of rent. I also want to point out an amazing feat of this long and arduous process. This is one of the few times during a policymaking process that research has been conducted as to the possible effects of the policy that Dr. Bates just explained earlier today. We do have a hint into the future kinds of access this policy will provide for many members of our community, and the results are staggering. They blew our minds. While not a representative sample, and with some limitations, it does speak to the effectiveness of this policy in achieving what it was intended to do, and they're better than we imagined at CAT. I also want to mention the myriad of policies that have been passed in the state, in the country, and in the county, and in the city that has not had any implementation dollars attached to them. We do not believe this should prevent the council from passing this policy in its attempt to address housing discrimination and economic and racial segregation. We do know that the status quo does not work, despite our best efforts to invest in housing access, affordable housing development, vouchers, etc. We cannot meet the volume of need that exists, and based on that, as well as the fact that, as well as fair housing standards, and as a city that falls under fair housing standards, we must pass this policy that addresses the private market. So City of Portland is at a crossroads. Are we going to continue to allow these loopholes to perpetuate layered racial and economic segregation? Are we going to continue to operate the status quo when we know it does not work? Or are we going to try something different? I have never, ever, and I'm sure way more experienced people than me have never seen a policy work perfectly in its first try, but we have always seen regret for inaction. We're living with regret right now. Let's not continue to make that mistake with this policy by not passing it. I am confident that we've done due diligence over this last year and a half to consider all perspectives, to tweak and tweak again and retweak, to invite opposing perspectives and consider implications, research potential impacts, and consider equity implications. It is fair, it is balanced, and it is a good step forward. And we look forward to seeing this policy pass.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor and council members. My name is Alan Lazo. I'm the Executive Director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Our mission at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon is to end housing discrimination and ensure equal access to housing throughout the state of Oregon. I'm going to do a couple things. First, I want to read a statement that was passed by our board and is an organizational statement. Then I also want to address some of the ways that our testing was characterized earlier and make sure that we're clear about how that works. So first of all, this is a statement about the rental screening criteria, and this is actually based on some earlier versions. So there are some specifics here that I want to tie to the current ordinance also. So the importance of screening criteria in the rental housing process and its intersection with fair housing cannot be overstated. Screening criteria are the literal measures by which an applicant's ability to be a good renter are judged. Similarly, screening criteria also help ensure the safety and peaceful enjoyment of housing for existing tenants and protect the legitimate business interests of housing providers. Those should be the only purposes such criteria serve. However, several criteria often used in the rental screening process can create equity barriers for many members of protected classes. Those most likely to experience impacts from equity barriers in screening criteria include communities of color, those perceived to be from another country other than the US, and people with disabilities. The Fair Housing Council of Oregon believes that principal among those equity barriers is the use of criminal history in the rental screening process. This concern is echoed by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development's April 2016 guidance on the use of criminal history in the screening process, noting the disparate impact on Black men and Latinos who are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system throughout the country. FHCO further believes that any successful proposed screening criteria must include an individualized assessment of an applicant's criminal history prior to any adverse action in the rental screening process. As such, we support the inclusion of this process in the proposed draft screening criteria ordinance. This was based on the iteration that was dated October 29th, 2018, probably somewhere in the draft 20s range. Specifically, FHCO supports the inclusion of the individualized assessment of criminal history as outlined in that draft as Section G sub B, and in the current ordinance as Section E sub 1 sub A, as well as the individualized assessment process that's outlined in that previous draft as Section H, and in the current ordinance as Section E sub 4. FHCO also believes there are several other fair housing-related elements that are critical to the success of any proposed screening criteria. Among those are acceptance of alternative forms of identification beyond a Social Security number, formerly Section E, now in the current ordinance as Section D sub 1, the ability of a landlord to screen all occupants of a household for criminal history and pattern in rental history of hostile, unsafe, or harassing behavior, formerly Section C sub C, and in the current ordinance as Section D sub 4 sub A, as well as clear standards for calculating a renter's share of rent when rental assistance is provided, formerly Section F sub C sub 1 through 3, now in the ordinance as Section D sub 3 sub C sub 1 through 3. So the use of screening criteria in the rental housing process should protect the interests of applicants, existing tenants, and housing providers. We believe and support a process that involves all stakeholders in establishing screening criteria that meet the needs and support the interests of all of these groups. So thank you. And I want to go back and talk a little bit about the testing that the Fair Housing Council of Oregon conducted, and I just want to clarify that what that testing shows is differential treatment of testers in that process. I'm not sure that we should characterize it as a means to change what screening criteria exists. Because what I would say about the way testing works is that we are looking to see, does one person get treated differently than the person who comes behind them? So it's sort of regardless of what the screening criteria are people being treated differently as an indication that discrimination or at least differential treatment may exist. So again, and the work that we did with the City of Portland over the last 10 years has been audit testing that really tells us about the trends in the marketplace. And it really is, with the number of tests that we perform during those time periods, aren't statistically significant numbers, so that we could say that pulling percentages out of them can be a little bit difficult to do. But it really does help us identify patterns in how differential treatment and discrimination may be used. But again, it may not matter what those screening criteria is. It's very rare. We wouldn't need to do that secret shopper testing if there were people out there saying, we're going to deny you based on your race or your color or your national origin, right? It's much more subtle, and that's what we're looking for. And that occurs regardless of what the screening criteria are. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions and address concerns after the presentations.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. My name is Deborah Imsey, and I'm the Executive Director for Multifamily Northwest. Multifamily Northwest is a nonprofit trade organization representing individuals, families, and businesses that provide more than 250,000 rental homes throughout Oregon, and more than 30,000 of those are in the city of Portland. While we share Commissioner Udaley's desire to reduce barriers to housing, the current 11-page proposal, where we have received more than 25 versions since the process began, is extremely complicated and contains numerous provisions which are unclear in terms of understanding and implementation. Although this remains true for all of our members, the greatest impact in terms of cost and implementation will be shouldered by providers of affordable housing. While there were nonprofit housing providers that participated in the beta testing, those were largely social service-oriented organizations with dual missions of housing and supportive services. By the nature of their good work, these organizations already have screening criteria similar to or even less restrictive than the low barrier screening criteria recommended in Commissioner Udaley's proposal, and as such would not be impacted. However, a vast number of affordable communities which house tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of people do not operate this way, and are simply offering affordable housing to residents who would otherwise be priced out of the market. These providers are not currently prepared with the resources that it will take to implement these proposals. Early analysis indicates that, for example, a provider with 600 affordable units will see an increase in screening-related costs of $60,000 a year. These costs will mean cuts in other program areas and possible reduction in housing stock. This analysis does not include anyone issuing a notice of denial, which will need a high level of legal expertise due to the complexity of the proposal, resulting in the need to consult attorneys. These additional resources will have to come from vital areas such as resident services, ground maintenance, capital improvements, basically stripping residents of the very things that help them maintain and enjoy their tenancies. The additional costs associated with the security deposit recommendations have not yet been determined, but will again provide an administrative burden that these affordable communities lack the resources to administer. I would like to add that these proposals come immediately after the passage of rent control, SB 608, on the state level and the city's relocation ordinance. Rental providers are struggling to implement and follow the new rules. If the law is implemented immediately or in short term, it would provide thousands of housing providers, including affordable housing providers, the need to expend more money on legal services because they will not have the time to modify their forms, their policies, their procedures, or to train their staff. We support the goal of increasing access to rental housing for all Oregonians. However, complicated policies will result in disinvestment of rental properties rather than finding ways to increase supply. Seattle, for example, is now showing a significant softening in rents after substantial increases in rental stock, moving to make housing more affordable and more available for all. If we do not have investment in the city to put more units on the market, regulation of housing providers won't solve these issues. There have been very good discussions regarding barriers. We believe that there is certainly more work to do to create a more equitable access to housing. However, with the complexity of this proposal, coupled with the many consequences it could create, we implore you to assemble a broader group to work collaboratively to ensure that smaller rental providers do not leave the city due to regulations they can't implement, and our affordable housing providers are not forced to reduce the vital services that help residents stay in their homes. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to move on to our third panel. We have Nicole Sharon, City of Portland, our ADA Title II and Disability Equity Manager, Hannah Holloway from the Urban League, Jessica Greenlee from Affinity Property Management, and Becky Strauss from Oregon Law Center. Everyone could come up. And we will go in the order I just announced, starting with Ms. Sharon. And please, everyone, just before you begin your testimony, state your name for the record.
Nicole Sharon, I'm with the Office of Equity and Human Rights. So I want to highlight some of the areas of the policy that I'm really excited about and help Jamie work on. When I worked at what is now called Civic Life, the #1 call that I got from people in the disability community was about the lack of affordable and accessible housing. We have tried over my 13 years of being here to try to get more things in policy to help mitigate that, and we're just not being successful. When Jamie brought this to PCOD to kind of vet it in the workshop, I saw an opportunity to maybe use this policy to increase access. So one of the big disconnects with accessible housing is that while we have certain fair housing laws that require certain elements of accessible housing, we have nothing that says those units have to be reserved for people who need them. And so there's actually no mechanism to make sure that people who need the units are in the units. So with this policy, what we've been able to do is, if a unit is going on the market that has accessibility features, the landlord would need to advertise that so that it would be clear to people what accessibility features were available. On top of that, there is now a provision that would say that if someone in that first 8-hour period that the unit was available applied, who had a disability, who needed those features, and say they were the last person in that 8-hour frame, this policy would say, we're going to bump them up to the top because we want to see people with disabilities be in the units that are there for them. The other piece of the policy that really helps us is the income limit. A lot of people with disabilities live on a fixed income, but they have income sources that aren't necessarily things on paper. And so with this kind of doubling of the income, it allows more people to use other resources to say, I can afford this housing, this is how I would do it. And we know that when people with disabilities get in a housing that works for them, they are 50% more likely to stay in that housing over 10 years because the lack of accessible housing in the country. I do want to say that we actually had a lot of other things that we had initially put in the policy, and because of a lot of pushback, we really lowered all of those things down to the 2 primary things that I spoke about. But I do think that we have to start addressing this somewhere, and I think this is a really good start. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. And I just want to briefly say that this is another challenge that I can personally attest to, having a son who uses a wheelchair, being a low-income cost-burden renter. I didn't have other housing options. I paid to install a 36-foot ramp on the rental house that I'm in, and time and time again, when I went to look at other units, I simply couldn't make them work for my son due to accessibility needs, and we just have a gross under availability of accessible units. Commissioner Hardesty, did you have a question?
Thank you. I just wanted, I was hoping that you would just remind people 5 minutes each so that we could actually get everybody in before we left.
All right, next up is Becky Strauss, who has to leave early, so thank you for accommodating her.
For accommodating that schedule. Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners, my name is Becky Strauss. I'm a staff attorney with the Oregon Law Center.
Thank you. Mike.
The Oregon Law Center is a nonprofit law firm whose mission is to achieve justice for low-income communities of Oregon by providing a full range of the highest quality legal services. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today in support of these proposals to address inequities in tenant screening practices, as well as collection and refund of security deposits. These policy changes would greatly benefit our clients. I echo and won't repeat all the comments made in support of these policies that we've heard today. I do want to put an emphasis on our client community and how these policies might benefit them, in particular, low-income families and renters. The vast majority of our clients have incomes at or below the federal poverty level. They're hardworking people, and they struggle to provide the necessities for themselves and their families. Helping them maintain safe, affordable places to live is a critical part of our work. As rental vacancy rates have plummeted and housing has become less and less affordable, our clients are struggling to meet these needs. Some of them are homeless, some of them homeownership is simply out of reach. Many barriers contribute to these situations, but a couple of them are your focus today and are important to address. Too often, applicants for rental housing are shut out due to screening policies that penalize applicants for issues in their background that really bear no rational relationship to their ability to be a good tenant. While facially neutral, the criteria statistically have a disparate impact on communities of color, people with disabilities. The criteria perpetuate inequity in housing and undermine fair housing principles. I see the two tracks of the screening criteria policy as addressing these two pieces. Track one, addressing primarily this idea that the council can make a statement about what is rational and relevant to a tenant screening. Track two, an acknowledgement to fair housing principles, and that landlords can adopt whatever screening criteria they choose, so long as they follow what would be outlined as a more detailed pathway to complying with fair housing laws. I think at the crux, that's what the screening criteria policy does, and it's very reasonable and would benefit our clients. In regard to security deposits, we have seen move-in requirements upwards of 4 times the rent for some of our clients, and certainly countless cases of wrongful withholding of those deposits after move-out. The lack of legal clarity around when a landlord can charge a tenant for damage after move-out enables this type of abuse and allows for landlords to hold tenants responsible for unaddressed repairs or simply routine turnover between tenancies. The unfair charges follow our clients, and the outstanding balance can expose them to things like collections actions, or repeated denials for housing. Low-income renters simply cannot compete amidst this landscape. The good news and what we've heard today is there are some things that we can do to address these barriers and improve access. These policy proposals on screening and security deposit take important steps toward a more equitable housing market. The screening criteria policy encourages landlords to evaluate tenants in the context of their entire relevant background, including the systemic barriers that historically disadvantage communities of color. Furthermore, the policy acknowledges that currently low-income renters are likely to be severely rent-burdened already, paying more than 50% of their income on housing, and this policy prioritizes their access to housing with a sensible recommendation for adjusting income to rent ratio requirements. The security deposit policy provides greater clarity to landlords and tenants regarding collection, withholding, and return of security deposits. Both of these policies would positively impact housing access and stability for our clients, and for these reasons, we urge your support. Thank you for the conversation and deliberation on them.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Hannah Holloway, and I'm here on behalf of the Urban League of Portland in support of these policies. The Urban League of Portland is a nonprofit civil rights direct service and advocacy organization that serves all of Oregon. Since 2015, we've operated a housing program that now serves 450 households annually through a combination of eviction prevention, permanent supportive housing, and rapid rehousing services. Our rapid rehousing program now exclusively serves members of the reentry population. We found that a prior conviction was the most common barrier to housing for folks that were calling into our housing hotline. The housing team works with people to clear past an outstanding debt. They can find gainful employment to raise their income ratio and more through wraparound services. But a criminal conviction is the one thing that we typically cannot change for people. It is a scarlet letter that follows people around for the rest of their lives, keeping them out of housing, no matter the nature of their conviction or how much time has lapsed. Landlords do deny for anything from low-level offenses to convictions for crimes that are no longer illegal. Without a legitimate safety or business reason to do so, however, these denials only strengthen discrimination and segregation in our housing market. HUD agrees with us, as you've heard, citing the overcriminalization of Black and Latinx communities. Its 2016 Disparate Impact Guidance cautioned providers that blanket denials based on criminal history had a disparate impact on applicants of color in violation of the Fair Housing Act. This guidance gave credence to what Black renters have long known, that status quo screening practices violate our rights as members of protected classes. Yet today, 3 years since that guidance released and 4 years since the Supreme Court ruling, discriminatory practices and blanket screens are still common. The policy before you today, the screening policy, helps Portland landlords fulfill their legal obligations to fair housing. It also creates safe harbor standards that landlords can apply if they prefer more legal certainty than a subjective assessment like an individualized assessment allows. These standards set realistic legal look-back periods, as well as extend to the other elements of applicants' backgrounds that correlate with race and where we often see discrimination. The new income standards give everyday Portlanders greater access to more housing. The cost of the average rental unit is out of step with median income, and people are already severely cost burdened, as you've heard today. As the 2018 State of Housing Report found, the average Black, Native, Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, and single mother households cannot afford rent in any neighborhood of Portland without dedicating over a third of their income. Higher income requirements effectively screen out all of these populations from our city altogether. While we don't want anyone to be cost burdened, of course, we do want to make sure that we at least have some ability to make the tough budgeting decisions, like dedicating over a third of our income required to stay housed in the city of Portland. The new 2 to 2.5 income standards in this policy do that and confront the myth that low-income folks lack the skills for responsible money management. The legal look-back periods establish new research-based standards that allow people to eventually access housing, which we know is a critical element of successful reentry. The first-in-time process, while not perfect, does minimize the discrimination that happens when landlords are allowed to cherry-pick their preferred tenants out of a vast pile. The new rental history standards also mean that landlords cannot consider no-cause evictions, which, as we know, have disproportionately been used against tenants of color as well. So using that to further deny future housing opportunities again reinforces racial discrimination and segregation in our housing market. The Urban League has endorsed this policy even though we think it should go further. We have endorsed this policy because of the research proving that it will increase access, because it codifies much of what landlords should already be doing to fulfill their legal, non-discriminatory obligations, and because of what it will mean for the people currently served by the Urban League's housing program, and what it could have meant for the 400-plus families that we served last year and the year before, in terms of accessing housing sooner, living on the streets and in our shelter system for less time. I'd like to thank Commissioner Udaly for championing this policy, and to Jamie for her dedication to a very long development and engagement process through which the Urban League was happy to inform this policy from the outset. From my involvement over the year and change, I can say with confidence that this ordinance before you today reflects the very best expertise and compromise from city staff, community advocates, landlords and fair housing attorneys, affordable and market rate providers, and the community partners who all informed its contents. Housing is essential. We truly and radically believe that at the Urban League. We believe everyone deserves housing, even those that will still be screened out under this new policy. Everyone deserves to sleep indoors, and Portland would be a better, safer, stronger city if this were the case. But it is withheld from too many in our city for outdated and arbitrary reasons that have nothing to do with the tenant's true risk or readiness to rent, and everything to do with discrimination and paternalism towards our low-income neighbors. This policy expresses our city value that housing is an essential foundational right, not just with words, but in policy and practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor, Commissioners, thank you so much for hearing from me today. My name is Jessica Greenlee, and I work for Affinity Property Management. Like many of the panel members before you, today I also serve on the Rental Services Commission, and have had the opportunity to watch this policy develop over the course of the past year. Like Jamie said, there's 33 versions, and I know she's worked very hard to try to incorporate the feedback she's received, but I feel like there are several opportunities that still exist, particularly within the screening policy itself, to reduce the amount of administrative burden and cost associated with implementing the policy. On its face right now, the exhibit that you have is 33 pages long and is quite complex. As Tyrone mentioned earlier, there are a diverse group of property managers of all different skill levels in the system. And when rolling out good public policy, you want it to be something that people can comply with and understand on its face. There have been simpler versions of this that have been introduced as alternative proposals at various points in time. Particularly of note in here right now, in the current system, somebody can submit an application, receive their screening results, and move into an apartment in one day. In fact, one of our communities in Northeast Portland, 46% of the applicants that have been approved for their homes do so. With this in and of itself, you have a confusing premise on the outside just from the advertisement standpoint, where we are going to be in a position that we're going to have to explain to renters that, yes, we can take your application, but we can't count it for 72 hours because the open application period doesn't start then, and then you have to wait an additional 8 hours to find out if yours is the first one in place for this unit. First come, first serve is often practiced by large landlord companies, like was stated previously, as is ours, and is the most common practice on applications. But in that position, that will be confusing to keep track of the time clock on that 72 hours for both our employees in the community, as well as the residents applying for that housing choice. I mean, you're going to have to keep track of the exact date and time that you're then allowed to submit an application in order to ensure your spot. It creates another level of sense of urgency, rather, that you may increase competition for those individual units, and it could feel like an additional barrier for people to access that housing in and of itself. I think that is a relatively easy fix in the policy to keep the basic premise of this. That being said, there are other opportunities within this as well to make adjustments. Again, I know that Jamie has heard me talk multiple times about this. There are some real confusing components of this as far as the non-governmental ID. What does that necessarily entail? What combination are you using? Is it an employee ID badge? If it's an employee ID badge, do you have to take it if somebody is self-employed as well? How do you get that proof necessarily in there? I guess my point in stating this is that this is not fully baked yet. As an ordinance, they're on the surface of it, then yes, this is something that furthers access to housing and is important for our city. A lot of these provisions already exist in HUD, and if there were more education programs available to landlords, they would understand the compliance factors they already are required to complete in order to provide some of the same provisions that exist within this. I just would love to get a further look into the actual detail, because we have to comply with the letter of the law, not the intent behind it. And the penalties for non-compliance in this are steep. There's also not a prevailing party provision within this, which can lend itself to frivolous lawsuits that you're going to have to continually defend, increasing the overall legal costs, which ultimately ends up increasing the cost of housing in general, because you have to be able to provide for the budget of operating that housing itself. So you're going to have to plan for those circumstances. The other item, which will be very cost prohibitive in the security deposit screening, is the requirement to develop the depreciation schedule on the onset of move-in. You have to understand that all of those schedules will then have to be maintained throughout the course of the life of that apartment. You have replacement of appliances. For example, in my own life, somebody replaced a ceiling fan in my apartment recently. We would then have to track that $50 part that just got fixed in there during the length of the tenancy, understand to restart the depreciation schedule, and keep all of that on hand all times, versus being able to keep the maintenance records on file. So you're constantly going to be adjusting that depreciation schedule that is included in the rental agreement by the time of the end of tenancy, and the need to distribute that information just adds to the actual work that takes place at the property, increasing labor costs. I know I'm kind of rambling here, and so I apologize. Public speaking is not my forte. One of the other points I wanted to bring back up, though, is that there had been some conversation about how do people with felonies currently obtain housing. There is that existing appeals process that is available to people by HUD. If they're outright denied, and then we have to provide them a notice that they have the opportunity to appeal now and get that individualized assessment. It then does not disrupt the workflow of everyone else who may qualify for those units, but then still gives them that opportunity to access that housing. And in that appeals process, they actually hold the unit at that point in time. So I'd love the opportunity to spend some more time with you guys on an individual basis to go over some of the details in this that I think, again, are opportunities to reduce the administrative costs associated with implementing an ordinance like this, if you would allow me that time at a future time. Thank you.
Commissioner Hurst.
Thank you, Mayor. We have community members today who don't have access to government IDs. What is your process today to help them get into housing?
So usually it's a combination of resources, but with the way this is outlined, it's very vague.
That wasn't my question. My question was really basic. Today, we have community members who do not have government-issued IDs, and are your housing units accessible to them today? And if so, what is the process to allow them access to those housing units?
They may have to provide a birth certificate or something with proof of date of birth, some other ID that we can use for screening purposes. I would say that the way that this is worded is what the challenge is, because again, it's vague, and it allows us to be able to, go ahead, sorry.
So that's okay. I was gonna say, so my dad was born a long time ago, and the hospital he was born in burned down, and so he does not have his birth certificate. So today in Oregon, if he actually wanted to get a driver's license, and he doesn't live in Oregon and he's 90-something, so we would want him to live and be driving anyway here. But my point is that based on Oregon law, he would not be eligible to get an Oregon ID. And so if he just happened to be out there trying to get housing, I would like to know how you would help him get housing.
But don't you think that responsibility lies in the public sector then to be able to provide access to those forms of being able to get that ID, or to utilize public resources to support those individuals
The
in
federal
that?
law
You're trying to ask
changed it.
somebody who may only own 1 or 2 housing units
It
to make
has nothing to do with
determinations
the
that are
number
much more
of-
complex.
Excuse me. My question is really a basic one, and you're choosing not to answer my question, and that's okay if you don't have the answer. I would appreciate it better if you just tell me you don't have the answer, and then I'll ask somebody that actually has the answer. Because it was a real straightforward question. It didn't need all that gray area.
All right, if we're done,
So could I just,
we just have
could I
5
ask
people
what-
left.
because I have a hard out at 5. And there's still a quorum, and I will absolutely make sure that I review the record, but I want to put a marker down. When people come here and testify, they deserve to be treated with respect. And I said that right up front. I don't care if people are for this or if they are against it. People here deserve to be treated with respect. I'm grateful that people take time off from work. Hannah, thank you. Jessica, thank you. And thank you, Jessica, for serving on the Rental Services Commission. I asked you to do that. You stood up to do it. Thank you.
Thank you
Asking
both.
a very specific question. Was that disrespectful?
So I'm in a little bit of a quandary. I have 5 people left here. We have 3 minutes. They've been sitting here the whole time. Can you give me 15 minutes?
I will give you 15 minutes.
Yes, sure,
Okay.
you bet.
All right, so I'm going to call up all 5, and I want you in the order I'm calling you, and you're going to have to limit to 3 minutes each. And I am going to ask Carla to run the timer. I apologize for that, but luckily hopefully some of what you have to say has already been said.
And
So-
we also accept written testimony
Yes.
at any time. Emails are always great.
Andy Miller from Human Solutions, Lisa Bonner Brown from Central City Concern, Christian Bryant from IRC Property Management, and then the 2 remaining people are June Schuman from New Portlanders Policy Commission and Linda Hastings from Southeast Works. Welcome, everyone, and Andy, go ahead and kick us off while everyone else gets settled.
Okay, I'm going to try to truncate my prepared
I
testimony,
apologize.
given the hour of the
Yeah.
day. That's okay. Mayor Wheeler, members of the council, for the record, my name is Andy Miller. I am the Executive Director of Human Solutions. We're your partner in East Portland and East Multnomah County in our collective response to the homeless and housing crisis, and we also help provide increased economic security for the diverse communities living in East Multnomah County. I'm here today to speak from our perspective, both as a provider of services and as an owner and operator of affordable housing, in effect a landlord. So we really have a dual role in this and a bit of a dual perspective, but I'll try to bring those together and do it all in now 2.5 minutes. So from our service provider perspective, we see the impact of the current screening practices. Our shelters and housing programs support families and individuals experiencing homelessness. We use rental assistance from local, state, and federal sources to leverage partnerships with the private market landlords. And we see every day that folks are stuck in our shelters long-term. They're stuck in our housing programs, unable to find housing because of the double jeopardy effect, in effect, of the criminal justice system. They're punished once for the sentence that they serve for their offense. They're punished a second time in an ongoing way, in that that sentence continues to serve as a barrier to both housing and employment. And we think that this measure sets a reasonable new bar, particularly with the low barrier criteria that are very similar to what we use as an affordable housing provider, to provide clear access and also clear rules of the road for how renters will come up against the screening criteria. I'm going to flip over to how we see this as a landlord and an affordable housing provider. As we shared with the Commissioner's Office during the process, myself and many of our colleagues already do use selection criteria that are less restrictive than what this policy would require. In fact, we are required by our public funders to use an income-to-rent ratio of 1.5 to 1. I don't know how folks do it, but they do it, and they pretty regularly pay their rent every month, with some exceptions. So it's possible. I think some of our reservations lie in the complexity of the policy, and our hope in supporting this policy is that through the rulemaking period, through the budget process, the rollout process, the city can ensure that this is an implementable policy. The last comment I have to make is really not about the policy, but it's about the intent of the policy and how we want to partner with you to achieve that intent. I appreciate I'm out of time. I'm going to say something real fast and just say, we know that this policy will continue to screen folks out. They don't have housing options. Our publicly funded affordable housing system should be their first option. We are not funded wholly and sustainably to provide the services and the risk mitigation that's needed to serve the population we want to serve. We want to partner with you, and work with the Housing Bureau to ensure that we are adequately funded, because everybody needs a place to live.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. Bonner-Brown.
Bonner Brown? Hi, good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and members of the Portland City Council. My name is Lisa Bonner.
Could you speak into the mic and make, yeah, there we go.
My name is Lisa Bonner Brown. Thank you, Commissioner Udaley, for the invitation to speak today. It is my honor to be here today. I am the housing specialist at Central City Concern for Flip the Script, the reentry program. Flip the Script is a program for individuals that have barriers to employment and housing, within housing the community from prison. I am overjoyed in front of this commission today. It is my role as a housing specialist to support Flip the Script clients as they reenter society to obtain housing. It is important for you to understand my clients are automatically denied each time that we apply for housing. Appealing each individual case can be disappointing, even the appeals are denied for the smallest of criminal charges, no matter how old the criminal charge is. Denial has become part of the application process. I'm expecting denial when I apply, and it's really sad. Myself and my clients must prepare for a denial, as well as an uphill battle, no matter how well they've been doing since their release. I prepare a packet of reasonable accommodation or an appeal letter. The packet consists of letters from recommendations from Multnomah County Community Justice Programs, parole officers, alcohol drug programs, certificates of completions of the programs mandated by the court, rent well programs. All these documents represent a lot of work that these people are doing when they get out and they enter our program. And these letters and recommendations should carry weight in consideration for a rental application. For instance, I have a client right now that's been denied 6 times. his charge is unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. A coworker of mine, he had a client apply the same apartment complex. He had multiple identity thefts, and he got accepted. I don't understand that. Landlords have a tendency to put our ex-offenders in a box. To date, my clients are spending $200 a week on application fees. Application fees are a big business for landlords here in Portland. When the rarity of applications are approved, my clients being required to pay a higher deposit. We paid $3,300 for one client for a unit, then the rent is less than $1,000 a month. The time has come for landlords to change their perspectives, renting to individuals who have turned their lives around. Housing is a remedy to mental health and many other issues in our community. Please fully consider the proposal before you today for individuals who are committed to changing their lives, have a place for having a safe place to live. We are a city that has a reputation of believing in our citizens, equality, fairness for all. Please vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It looks like Christian Bryant isn't present, so we'll move on to June Schuman. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioners. My name is June Arima Schuman, and I am an appointed member of the New Portlanders Policy Commission. Today, I'm speaking in support for the housing screening criteria policy on behalf of the New Portlanders Policy Commission. The New Portlander Policy Commission has been in contact with Jamie Duhamel, the Commissioner Udaley's housing policy advisor, and we have been keeping abreast of the policy and its updates and sharing our concerns and recommended solutions. Our communities have shared these concerns regarding their housing. Number one, the immigrant and refugee communities suffered the hardest from the ripple effect of burdensome and inordinate rent increases and no-cause eviction notices. Often due to language and cultural barriers, these sudden changes in their housing create unnecessary displacement, stress, trauma, and disruption to families. Two, because of these sudden Three, the New Portlander families often experience discrimination in the application and selection process in the form of racism, high application fees, and/or landlord unresponsiveness to renters' inquiries. These experiences further complicated what would normally be a fair and objective process. For these reasons, MPPC supports the screening criteria policy proposal as we believe it will offer a clearer, more transparent communication process between renter and landlord, as well as equitable and dignified access to housing. In addition, we specifically support that these following changes in the screening policy: allowing for different forms of identification beyond government-issued ID, because immigrants and refugees often are in-process immigration issues, for example, or other status changes. This allowance would permit immigrant communities to use other forms of officially issued IDs they possess. Lowering the income to rent ratio to 2 times the current monthly rent, which would allow families greater rental options and opportunity to remain closer to their chosen area of residence. Providing for an individualized assessment that accounts for the applicant as a whole person. No applicant should be denied housing without this approach. This will reduce, I have one more, this will reduce the stigmatized and/or discriminatory practices. Lastly, asking landlords to set an open application period would support immigrant and refugee communities in overcoming current application barriers and successfully applying for housing. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Linda Hastings from Southeast Works.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Linda.
Mayor Wheeler and honorable commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Linda Hastings, and I'm the Justice Coordinator at Southeast Works. Since 1997, Southeast Works has been serving justice-involved individuals in the Lentz area of Southeast Portland, also called Felony Flats. Last year, Southeast Works served 8,600 individuals looking for work, education, training, who assessed our services 23,000 times. Almost 30% of the 8,600 we served self-attested to having former justice involvement. After 22 years of working with justice-involved individuals, we know that stable housing is the foundation of successful re-entry from prison. Unfortunately, many formerly incarcerated people struggle to find stable places to live. A big part of the work focuses on assisting individuals who have been released from jail or prison to reintegrate back into the community. Part of the integration is the ability to find clean and safe, affordable housing. We know that the transition from prison to the community is full of challenges. In doing our work, we know that before formerly incarcerated people can address health problems, find stable jobs, or learn new skills, they need to have a place to live. This is one of the most frustrating experiences working with our customers. They are able to get certification, secure decent jobs, apprenticeships, CDL training, and solid placement, and they make good wages and benefit. However, they cannot secure housing. Their prior backgrounds are held against them, and landlords are reluctant to allow them to rent units. Discrimination and combined with affordable housing shortages continues to drive the exclusion of formerly incarcerated people from the housing market. A big part of the problem is that property owners have the ability to implement their own screening criteria to determine if an applicant merits housing, a process that relies on criminal record checks as the primary source of information. This means landlords have the ability to punish people with criminal records even after their sentence is over. They have served their time and need to move on to create a crime-free and pro-social life for themselves and the communities. Housing is a big part of the city and can assist by developing policies that address and correct the unfairness. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for getting us in 3 minutes sooner than my colleagues promised to be here. Closing remarks?
Commissioner Schuman, I just have a question. Did the New Portlanders Policy Commission discuss the fact that immigrants and refugees are less likely to have computers and cell phones, so the first in, first serve might not result in more housing being rented to immigrant and refugees? Did the commission talk about that at all?
I'm not sure that I know precisely the answer to your question. But I think it may be one of those among many other issues that interfere in housing access. So, but I will raise it with the other people on our commission and have them look into more precise response if you want us to.
But there wasn't much discussion at the commission about that issue, in connection with this policy. Was there any discussion at the commission about that issue?
No, I'm not aware of that, no.
Thank you.
I can answer that. That's why we have the 3-day advertising rule, to allow people that have language barriers the chance to get assistance with filling out the application.
Yeah, the issue then is once the time starts, then you have to be able to quickly get in to be first in. So I just wanted to know whether the commission
I'm not
discussed
sure
it.
how we would solve for what you're talking about. We've done our best to account for that challenge.
Well, let me just say that I greatly appreciate direct questions, and I hope that nobody felt like you were attacking Commissioner Fritz because you asked a direct question. I think it's important that we are able to ask specific questions so that we all have a better understanding of what's taking place in this building.
Yeah.
So I thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, thanks again, everyone, for being here. We will return tomorrow at 2 for open public testimony. And
Very good. Thank you, everyone. We are adjourned.